Story 1. The birth of a fleet, Rome before the sea. Before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, before triremes carried her eagle standards across the horizon, the Romans were a people of the river. The Tiber wound through their lives like a slow brown artery, neither grand nor gentle but practical. It gave water, trade, and a sense of direction north to the Etruscans, south to the Latins, and westward always to the sea they did not yet understand. In the early centuries of the Roman kingdom and the young republic, seafaring was something other people did. The Greeks built ships with sleek hulls and poetic names. The Phoenicians charted stars across unknown coasts. The Etruscans, to the north, had already learned the uneasy rhythm of the tides and the profit of maritime trade. Rome, meanwhile, was content with its fields, its hills, and its slow inland river. The sea was distant, a glimmer of salt and uncertainty, at the edge of a farmer's imagination. The Romans were farmers first, soldiers second, and sailors not at all. Their early history reflects this stubborn practicality. When Livy and Polybius later chronicled Rome's first naval encounters, both seemed mildly astonished that such a people could ever become a sea power. Yet in this lack of ambition lay a peculiar kind of strength. The Romans did not approach the sea as explorers or dreamers, but as engineers of necessity. The river economy. Before the navy, there was the barge. Small, flat-bottomed vessels plied the Tiber, moving clay, timber, and grain from the interior. Their construction was simple planks of oak or pine pegged together, sealed with pitch, driven by poles and oars rather than sails. It was slow work, but it worked. These vessels linked the Roman hinterland to Ostia, the port at the mouth of the Tiber, where imported goods arrived and exports departed. Ostia itself was less a bustling harbor and more a muddy delta in those early days. Ships from Etruria and Carthage anchored offshore, their crews wary of Roman inexperience. Rome's contact with the maritime world came through these foreign merchants speaking strange dialects, wearing fine fabrics, and carrying stories of lands where the sea never ended. The Romans, ever practical, cared less for stories than for goods. They traded in salt, the most vital commodity of all, and watched carefully as these outsiders unloaded amphorae of oil, wine, and fish sauce. The Latin word navis, ship, existed, but it was a borrowed word, used cautiously. For generations, Rome's relationship with ships was one of curiosity, not identity. This would change only when necessity demanded it. The reluctant turn toward the sea. That necessity came, as it often did, in war. The 5th and 4th centuries BCE were centuries of consolidation, Rome pushing outward from Latium into Etruria, Campania, and beyond. The growing city needed supplies, allies, and security. Controlling the land was one thing, but enemies now began to appear from across the waves. Etruscan pirates occasionally harried Roman traders. Greek colonies in southern Italy, Tarentum, Neapolis, and Croton maintained fleets that could disrupt coastal routes. And the Carthaginians, the great maritime power of the western Mediterranean, were quietly watching from the horizon. Rome, it seemed, could not stay landlocked forever. Yet even as this awareness grew, the early republic hesitated. Building ships required timber, bronze, and skill resources that could be better spent on legions and fortifications. When naval matters arose, Rome relied on its allies, particularly the Latin cities and Etruscan shipwrights. The early Socii Navals naval allies provided vessels and crews when the Senate decreed it. Rome's contribution was often organizational, not nautical. The commanders were senators who had never held an oar in their lives. One can almost imagine the bemused Greek sailors watching as these Roman officials tried to issue commands at sea, still dressed in their senatorial togas, shouting orders as if directing infantry maneuvers. Inexperience was not a sin in Rome, it was a challenge to be conquered. The sea as a frontier. The Mediterranean in the early 3rd century BCE was not yet Roman. It was a patchwork of powers: Carthaginian trade routes to the west, Greek naval networks to the east, Etruscan remnants to the north. Each coast spoke a different language of navigation. For the Romans, the sea was both a frontier and a mirror, unpredictable, dangerous, and full of potential spoils. It is easy to overlook how strange and fearful the sea seemed to a people of the soil. Roman religion had few maritime deities. Neptune, later equated with the Greek Poseidon, was initially a god of freshwater, of springs and rivers. Only later did he become the lord of the sea. This linguistic detail tells us something profound about Roman psychology. They approached the sea as they did everything else, by absorbing and redefining it in their own image. When the Roman armies reached the coasts of Campania and began to encounter Greek harbors, they must have looked upon the docks and breakwaters with a kind of pragmatic wonder. The Greeks had long understood that the sea could be tamed with stone, geometry, and patience. Rome, in time, would learn this lesson with terrifying efficiency. Borrowing from the masters. It is said that when Rome finally decided to build a fleet, they copied a captured Carthaginian ship plank by plank. Whether this story is literally true or a symbolic exaggeration, it captures the Roman habit of imitation through mastery. They learned by stealing, then improving. Before that great leap, however, there were the quiet decades of preparation: shipwrights trained in Etruria, contracts made with coastal allies, and a slow accumulation of maritime knowledge. Romans began to map their coasts, not as poets but as logisticians. They measured distances in rowing hours and supply rations. They learned how to store grain to keep it dry, how to waterproof wood, how to calculate the cost of replacing a mast. These are the details that rarely make it into grand histories, yet they are the details that made empire possible. The first Roman sailors were not heroes, they were laborers, often freedmen or conscripted peasants who found themselves rowing toward an unfamiliar horizon. Many could not swim. The sea was an alien element, cold, infinite, and indifferent. The oar was heavy, the discipline harsh, and the rewards uncertain. Yet this dull, repetitive labor would become the pulse of an empire. The cultural shift. What fascinates historians is how quickly Rome's identity began to shift once it entered the maritime sphere. Contact with Greek cities brought exposure to art, philosophy, and a cosmopolitan sense of trade. The sea opened not only routes but also minds. Senators began investing in shipping ventures. Port officials gained prestige. Even the language of politics began to borrow nautical metaphors: navis publica for state vessels, classis for fleets, gubernator for a helmsman who guided both ships and policy. The sea, once feared, became a metaphor for control, something that could be measured, disciplined, and ultimately ruled. The Romans did not romanticize it, they industrialized it. A society on the edge of the sea. By the mid-4th century BCE, Rome had established itself as a regional power, but its maritime capacity remained modest. Small coastal patrols operated from Ostia, primarily to secure the grain supply and guard against pirates. The real challenge, however, was still to come: the confrontation with Carthage, whose ships had ruled the western Mediterranean for centuries. Yet before Rome could face Carthage, it had to finish becoming something it had never been: a seafaring state. The infrastructure of empire docks, depots, signal towers all had to be invented from scratch. For every admiral who would one day command at Actium or Mylae, there were hundreds of nameless carpenters, rowers, and clerks whose daily routines transformed a river city into a maritime empire. One imagines an ordinary Roman sailor in those early days, sitting on the deck of a small galley, staring toward the horizon. The sea around him smells of pitch and salt. The waves slap against the hull with rhythmic monotony. The oar blisters his hands, the wind stings his eyes. He does not yet know he is part of something that will reshape the known world. To him, it is simply work: hard, endless, necessary work. The empire, like the fleet, would be built from such labor. The inevitable question. And so, as the Tiber continued to flow toward the sea, so too did the ambitions of Rome. Each year, more ships appeared at Ostia, more sailors learned the language of tides and winds, and more senators began to see that the destiny of Rome might lie not on land, but upon the restless water. But what happens when a people who have always trusted the firmness of soil commit themselves to the uncertainty of the sea? Would the discipline that made Rome so powerful on land prove strong enough to master the waves? It began, as so many things did in Rome, not with innovation but with replication. By the early 3rd century BCE, the Romans found themselves in a precarious but historic position. Their expansion through the Italian peninsula had brought them into increasingly direct conflict with the maritime powers of the Mediterranean, particularly the Carthaginians. This conflict, which would become known as the First Punic War, would force Rome to do something truly unprecedented: become a naval power from scratch. And so, for the first time in Roman history, the Senate allocated resources not merely for ships, but for a fleet and organized, strategic, and permanent maritime force. It was a decision born from desperation and strategic foresight, a response to Carthaginian naval superiority. But in typical Roman fashion, it was executed with a level of bureaucratic precision and logistical determination that would, in time, overwhelm even the most seasoned maritime civilizations. The legend of the captured quinquereme. Polybius, the Greek historian who admired Rome's disciplined methods, tells the story with a mixture of awe and amusement. According to him, around 260 BCE, a Carthaginian quinquereme, a large warship with 5 rows of oarsmen, ran aground on Italian shores during a storm. The Romans, ever observant, studied the wreck. They dissected its structure, traced the hull, measured the oar spacing, and then issued orders: build 100 of these immediately. Whether this story is factually accurate or simply a symbolic narrative, it reflects Rome's method: reverse engineer the enemy, then mass produce. Within months, Roman shipwrights, many of them Etruscan, Greek, or enslaved specialists, constructed dozens of quinqueremes. But these were not elegant ships. They were heavier, clumsier, and less balanced than their Carthaginian models. The hulls were slightly bulkier, their maneuverability less refined. Yet they had one crucial advantage: they were designed not for naval finesse but for Roman soldiers. This would be the heart of Rome's naval strategy: turned sea battles into land battles. The invention of the corvus. To compensate for their crew's lack of sailing experience and rowing skill, the Romans engineered a bold and brutal solution: the corvus. The corvus, Latin for crow, was a long wooden boarding bridge, roughly 11 meters in length, mounted at the prow of Roman warships. At its end was a heavy iron spike, designed to slam down onto the enemy deck and grip it like a talon. Once in place, Roman marines would charge across the bridge, turning what had been a naval engagement into close-quarters infantry combat, an arena in which the Romans excelled. It was, in essence, a floating battlefield. The corvus allowed the Romans to bypass the centuries of sailing experience their Carthaginian rivals possessed. Instead of relying on superior seamanship, they relied on superior discipline, armor, and formations. Historians often debate how effective or practical the corvus was in the long term. It added weight, made ships more prone to capsizing in high seas, and was eventually abandoned. But in these early days, it was revolutionary. It also revealed something essential about Roman military thinking. When confronted with a challenge, they did not attempt to become experts in that field. They simply redefined the rules of engagement to favor their own strengths. Logistics, the unsung war effort. The rapid construction of a navy was not just a feat of shipbuilding. It was a logistical transformation. Timber had to be harvested in enormous quantities, primarily oak and pine from central Italy. Bronze had to be sourced and forged into nails, fittings, anchors, and spikes. Tar, pitch, and hemp were requisitioned for sealing hulls and making ropes. Thousands of men were needed, not just rowers, but carpenters, blacksmiths, sailmakers, and rope spinners. Entire temporary ports and shipyards were erected along the western coast of Italy. The Romans even established naval training schools where men who had never been to sea were taught the basics of rowing in dryland simulators. Planks and benches were set on the ground in rows. Soldiers would sit and practice the rhythm of the stroke without ever touching water. It is a strange image, the future rulers of the Mediterranean pretending to row ships in a field. Yet these drills worked. In time, thousands of rowers learned to move in unison. Officers learned to navigate, to read the winds, to calculate timing and tide. It was not graceful, but it was organized, and that, more than anything, was the Roman advantage. The first engagements. By 260 BCE, Rome had assembled a fleet of roughly 140 warships, a mixture of triremes and quinquiremes, and set out under the command of Gaius Duilius. Their first major naval battle would occur near Mylae, off the north coast of Sicily, an island contested by both Rome and Carthage. The Carthaginians, confident in their naval superiority, approached in classic formation, prepared to ram and outmaneuver. But they had not anticipated the corvus. As their ships closed in, Roman vessels dropped the boarding bridges. One by one, Carthaginian ships were boarded, seized, and turned into floating fortresses. In the span of a few hours, Rome captured over 50 enemy ships, a stunning, improbable victory. Duilius became the first Roman to command a naval victory. He was granted a triumph in Rome, a parade through the city, and erected a column in the Forum featuring the prows of captured ships, rostra, a monument that would later give its name to the speaker's platform in Roman political life. Rome had proven at least once that it could win at sea, but the sea, unlike land, was far less forgiving. Discipline and difficulty. Daily life aboard a Roman warship was not glorious. Rowers sat shoulder to shoulder on benches slick with sweat and sea spray. Meals were simple bread, olives, dried fish. Water was rationed and often spoiled. Sanitation was minimal. On long voyages, scurvy and dysentery were common. Most of the rowers were not slaves, as commonly assumed, but lower-class citizens or allies fulfilling military obligations. Officers slept little better, confined in cramped quarters, constantly exposed to the weather. Unlike in the legions, where centuries of tradition and infrastructure supported the troops, the Navy was new, untested, experimental, and often forgotten by the Senate until crisis struck. Weather posed as much danger as enemy fleets. Storms could scatter ships, capsize heavy vessels equipped with corvus, and leave men adrift in an ocean they barely understood. Rome lost multiple fleets in sudden storms, thousands of men and hundreds of ships not in battle, but to bad forecasts and poor seamanship. And yet each time they rebuilt. This willingness to absorb losses, learn, and persist was perhaps the most Roman trait of all. Other nations might have turned away from the sea after such failures. Rome doubled down. Bureaucracy at sea. The Roman military functioned through an elaborate system of ranks, responsibilities, and record-keeping. As the Navy grew, so did the need for naval bureaucrats. Clerks documented ship rosters, supply lists, rations, and maintenance cycles. Quartermasters calculated how much grain and water each vessel required for a crossing. Messengers relayed orders across ports. Engineers designed ship sheds and slipways for launching and repair. Ostia was transformed from a sleepy river delta into a functioning harbor. The port of Centumcelli, modern Civitavecchia, and others were developed. Warehouses lined the docks. Grain flowed in from Sicily and Sardinia. Metal arrived from Iberia. Each piece of this infrastructure served a single purpose: sustain the fleet. If the land was Rome's spine, the sea was becoming its nervous system, branching, signaling, feeding, and defending. Cultural implications. Rome's transformation into a maritime power didn't just affect war. It began to shift cultural values. Naval victories brought glory. Young aristocrats began to seek naval commands. Sea metaphors entered Roman rhetoric and literature. Poets described storms and sails. Orators spoke of steering the state like a vessel through troubled waters. More subtly, the sea introduced Romans to new foods, goods, and ways of life. Fish sauce garum, olives from Hispania, Egyptian linen, and Syrian glass, these became staples of Roman markets, made accessible by regular shipping lanes. Port cities began to thrive, and coastal trade was normalized. The Navy, in its dull routines of patrol and convoy, helped secure not only military victories, but also the economic integration of a growing empire. Yet even as Rome expanded its influence by sea, it remained a land power at heart, uneasy in foreign waters, perpetually seeking to anchor its ships in firm, familiar harbors. And so, the question lingered in the Senate halls and on distant decks: could a civilization born in fields and forests truly rule the sea? Could the Romans, so grounded in structure and soil, embrace the unpredictability of wind and wave, or would the sea, in time, remind them of their limitations? The sea had accepted Rome's challenge and responded with merciless indifference. What followed Rome's first great naval successes was not a triumphal age of maritime dominance, but a lesson in humility. The decades after Mylae, the first Roman naval victory in 260 BCE, tested the fledgling fleet's resolve in ways that battles alone could not. For every victory, there came disaster. For every bold expansion, there came loss. But it was in these very disasters, often forgotten in grand historical narratives, that Rome's naval mindset was forged. Not in glory, but in ruin and recovery. Not in heroism, but in repetition, repair, and the mundane cycles of survival at sea. The cost of victory, the Roman way of war at sea. The First Punic War dragged on for over 2 decades, from 264 to 241 BCE, and saw the creation and destruction of multiple Roman fleets. The battles are familiar to historians: Ecnomus, Cape Hermium, Drepana, and the final, decisive clash at the Aegates Islands. But in between these engagements were the real trials, the storms. The worst came in 255 BCE. Flush from a land victory in Africa, the Romans sought to evacuate their army back across the sea. They sent a massive fleet, 364 ships in total, to retrieve the soldiers. Loaded with men, loot, and supplies, the fleet set sail for Sicily. But off the coast of Camarina, a storm struck. Roman ships, never designed for open ocean resilience, especially not with their heavy corvi boarding bridges and top-heavy designs, were thrown into chaos. Wave after wave smashed hulls, snapped masts, and splintered decks. Over 250 ships were lost. Over 100,000 men perished. It was the single greatest maritime loss in Roman history, and it was not caused by enemy action, but by rain, wind, and Roman inexperience. The sea, it seemed, could not be conquered by courage alone. Rebuilding again and again. The Roman reaction was not retreat but reconstruction. Despite devastating losses, the Senate approved another massive fleet within a year. Funds were raised, trees were cut, iron was forged, shipyards were reactivated. The work was routine by now. Rome was learning that naval power was not about brilliance but about maintenance. But disaster struck again just a few years later. In 253 BCE, another fleet was caught in yet another storm, this time off the coast of Minerva. 150 more ships were lost. Then again in 249 BCE, at the Battle of Drepana, the Romans suffered their greatest naval defeat, losing 93 ships to a better prepared Carthaginian force. Here, too, the corvus failed. Its weight made Roman ships sluggish, vulnerable to Carthaginian rams and nimble maneuvers. In the aftermath, Rome made a radical decision: abandon the corvus. The bridge that had allowed Roman soldiers to fight land battles at sea was no longer useful. With experience, Roman sailors had begun to adapt. They could row now. They could maneuver. And so, in a quiet way, Rome began to become a maritime power, not through invention, but through survival. They were no longer merely trying to make the sea like land. They were learning to live with it. The Aegates Islands and the power of logistics. In 241 BCE, the First Punic War reached its conclusion with one final naval engagement, the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Carthage, worn thin by years of war, had little left to commit to sea defense. Rome, by contrast, had built yet another fleet privately financed by wealthy citizens after the state coffers had been exhausted. This fleet was leaner, lighter, and no longer burdened by the corvus. Its crews were trained, its commanders cautious. The Romans intercepted the Carthaginian supply fleet near the Aegates and destroyed it. The victory was not dramatic in tactics but decisive in effect. Carthage, unable to sustain the war, sued for peace. Rome's first naval war had ended. An inland city, raised on hills and rivers, had defeated the greatest maritime empire of the Western Mediterranean. But the cost had been staggering. Over 600 ships lost, tens of thousands of lives, an economy strained, a people hardened. And yet the fleet stood. Naval infrastructure and the institutional mind. In the aftermath of the war, Rome began laying the permanent groundwork for a navy that would last centuries. The old ad hoc methods were not enough. Naval power required stable institutions. New ports were developed. Dry docks and navalia, military shipyards, became permanent fixtures in coastal cities. Specialized magistrates, duumviri navals, were given charge of fleets. Officers were trained not just in combat but in maintenance, discipline, and navigation. The idea of a standing naval force, not just temporary war fleets, took hold. More importantly, logistics, the dull, bureaucratic engine of empire, was refined. Roman quartermasters began tracking supplies with greater precision. Cargo manifests, maintenance schedules, rations per mile, these became standard. The Navy was now a system, not just a force. Ships had names, crews had records, even the ropes had documentation: where they were sourced, how they were twisted, how often they were replaced. In this, Rome's sea power mirrored its land legions, meticulous, methodical, and almost obsessive in administration. Culture adrift, the psychological shift. Over the decades, a subtle transformation had occurred within Roman identity. The sea, once feared and distrusted, had become familiar. Sailors returned home with stories of distant shores, exotic customs, and strange goods. Amphorae filled with Spanish wine and North African olives became common in Roman markets. Foreign spices, linens, and scrolls arrived not as curiosities but as commodities. Even Roman literature began to reflect this shift. Poets like Aeneas and Nevius, both veterans of the Punic Wars, wrote of ships and storms, of distant battles and heroic voyages. The sea was no longer a barrier, but a stage. Naval service, too, gained prestige. While never as honored as the legions, the fleet earned respect. Veterans settled in coastal colonies, bringing maritime skills inland. Young men who once dreamed only of legionary glory began to consider command at sea. The bureaucracy of the fleet even shaped Roman politics. By the 2nd century BCE, naval contracts building, provisioning, and supplying ships became lucrative. Senators invested in port ventures. Equites, the Roman knight class, bid on shipping contracts. The sea, once foreign, had become profitable. Rome had not only won control of the Western Mediterranean, it had integrated the sea into its worldview. From reluctance to domination. This transformation did not happen quickly or easily or with any grand statement of maritime destiny. It happened as most Roman things did, incrementally, through routine, stubbornness, and systems. It is tempting to imagine a clean break moment when Rome became a naval power, but the truth is more mundane and more revealing. Rome drifted into maritime strength, one contract, one rebuilt ship, one repaired rope at a time. There were no sea gods to thank. There were only sailors, carpenters, and administrators, thousands of them performing thankless tasks with no expectation of glory. They rowed, they repaired, they endured. And over time, those dull acts of repetition became empire. By 200 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy, most of the western Mediterranean islands, and had begun to challenge Greek powers in the east. Its fleets patrolled trade routes. Its ports buzzed with activity. Its bureaucrats charted the tides. The city that once feared the sea now ruled it. Final reflection: the silent power of boredom. There is a strange beauty in how Rome became a naval empire not through genius, but through routine, not through brilliance, but through repetition. It is easy to overlook the dull parts of history: the ship manifests, the warehouse ledgers, the carpenters who shaped oars by hand, day after day, with no thought of legacy. But those are the people who built Rome's maritime power. They are why grain arrived on time, why legions could be supplied overseas, why messages reached distant governors, why pirates were hunted, why trade routes were stable. Rome did not simply conquer the sea, it scheduled it, indexed it, filed it away in scrolls. And in doing so, it transformed itself not just as a military power, but as a civilization that could stretch across continents, connected not by roads, but by water. So as you drift, perhaps, into sleep, imagine the creak of wooden beams on a night patrol, the steady slap of oars against the sea, the quiet murmur of a naval clerk scratching ink onto wax, the whisper of sails catching wind in the early dark. Rome at sea, not conquering, just enduring. That, in the end, was its greatest strength. Story 2. The First Punic War: Learning to Sail and Fight. The First Punic War was not supposed to happen. When Rome and Carthage first encountered one another in the early 3rd century BCE, they had every reason to cooperate. Carthage, based in the wealthy North African city of the same name, ruled a commercial empire stretching across the western Mediterranean. Rome, having consolidated control over the Italian peninsula, had no colonies, few ships, and little desire to interfere with maritime trade. For a time, the two republics even signed treaties. They respected one another's spheres of influence. Roman merchants were given rights in Carthaginian ports, and vice versa. It was a model of parallel expansion. But like most empires, they collided not because of direct ambition, but because of something much smaller. A town, a group of mercenaries, a request for help. And an island. The island of Sicily. Sicily sat in the center of the Mediterranean like a forgotten keystone. Fertile, mountainous, and geographically unavoidable, it was the battleground between Greek settlers in the east, Carthaginian colonies in the west, and a patchwork of native Sicilian tribes in between. For centuries, these groups fought each other local wars, shifting alliances, temporary occupations. In the early 260s BCE, one such conflict spiraled out of control. The city of Messana, on Sicily's northeastern tip, had been taken by a band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines. Their control was tenuous. Facing attack from the nearby Greek city of Syracuse, they did what many small powers did: they asked for help. They asked both Rome and Carthage. Carthage, ever the maritime opportunist, responded first. It landed troops and garrisoned Messana. But the Mamertines, fearing Carthaginian control, quickly reached out to Rome again. In a moment of strategic indecision, the Romans agreed. In 264 BCE, a Roman force crossed the strait and entered Messana. Carthaginian honor was bruised. Syracuse saw opportunity. And so began the First Punic War, not over ideology, empire, or religion, but over a poorly managed town and a web of clumsy diplomacy. Rome had entered its first overseas conflict, the uncharted waters of foreign war. To fight in Sicily, Rome needed to project power across the narrow but perilous Strait of Messina. This required ships, supply lines, and a naval presence capable of more than just coast-hugging barges. Initially, Roman armies operated in familiar ways. They marched, besieged, negotiated. But Sicily's geography defied traditional Roman strategy. The interior was mountainous and difficult to traverse. Coastal cities were better supplied by sea than by land. Carthage, with its navy, could land reinforcements and supplies almost anywhere and withdraw at will. Rome could not match this mobility. Their early campaigns in Sicily were hampered by logistical delays. Roman supply trains were slow. Communications took weeks. Siege equipment had to be disassembled and hauled overland. Meanwhile, Carthaginian ships moved grain, troops, and weapons from North Africa to Sicily with relative ease. It became painfully clear. This would not be a land war alone. Control of Sicily meant control of the surrounding sea. And Rome, for all its land-based prowess, had no navy. The shadow of Carthage. To understand Rome's challenge, one must understand what Carthage was. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders, Carthage was not just a city, it was a maritime machine. Its wealth came from trade: silver from Iberia, tin from Britain, ivory from Africa, and countless other goods. Its merchant fleet was unmatched in scale. Its harbors were masterpieces of design, with circular docks, secret shipyards, and sophisticated naval infrastructure. Its warships, primarily quinquiremes, were fast, maneuverable, and manned by skilled crews. Its admirals were veterans. Its maritime strategy had been refined over generations. Carthage had no need to invent sea power. It had been born in it. Rome, by contrast, was experimenting. Carthaginian commanders scoffed at Rome's early naval efforts. When they heard that Rome had begun building ships, they reportedly laughed. These were farmers, they said, soldiers who feared deep water. They would sink before they sailed. This underestimation would become a pattern and a mistake. Roman innovation by imitation. As covered in Story 1, Rome's first naval efforts relied heavily on copying Carthaginian designs. They learned from captured ships. They recruited foreign shipwrights. They trained oarsmen on land, drilling them in rhythm and coordination long before they ever touched water. But the most important Roman innovation was strategic, not technical. Roman commanders quickly recognized that they could not win at sea through sailing alone. Their sailors were inexperienced. Their ships were slower. They were unlikely to outmaneuver Carthaginian fleets. So they changed the nature of naval warfare. The corvus, the boarding bridge introduced during the early years of the war, transformed naval engagements from maneuver-based duels into floating land battles. Roman marines, armored like legionaries, could board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. It was brutal, clumsy, and effective. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the corvus was used to great effect. Gaius Duilius, Rome's naval commander, defeated a Carthaginian fleet by boarding their ships one by one. Over 50 Carthaginian vessels were captured. Rome's first major naval victory was complete. The corvus turned Roman weaknesses into strengths, a pattern that would define their strategy for years to come. Sicilian stalemate. But success at sea did not immediately lead to victory on land. Sicily was a maze of fortified cities, unpredictable allies, and harsh terrain. Roman commanders found themselves bogged down in sieges. Carthage, though often defeated in pitched land battles, used its navy to reinforce key ports, resupply garrisons, and raid Roman positions. It became a war of attrition. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Roman armies lived off the land, often short on supplies. Disease was rampant. Morale fluctuated. Both sides poured resources into the conflict, hoping to tip the balance, but neither could deliver the final blow. Rome's problem was logistics. Its armies were not designed for long overseas campaigns. Supply lines stretched across the sea from Italy to Sicily, vulnerable to storms and Carthaginian raiders. Rome responded by building more ships, hundreds of them. It created convoy systems, naval escorts, and port infrastructure. Carthage, for its part, relied increasingly on mercenary Spanish, Gallic, and Numidian troops, as its own population was unwilling to fight prolonged wars. This dependency would later prove fatal, but during the First Punic War, it provided manpower without political risk. The war dragged on. By 255 BCE, Rome had even attempted an invasion of North Africa. It failed. The army was defeated. The fleet sent to retrieve it was destroyed in a storm. 100,000 men perished. It was a disaster of unprecedented scale, and yet Rome rebuilt. This stubbornness, this refusal to retreat confused and frightened Carthage. They had expected Rome to negotiate after such a loss. Instead, the Romans doubled down. They constructed another fleet. The mindset of repetition. What Rome lacked in maritime elegance, it made up for in persistence. Each time a fleet was lost to storms, battles, or incompetence, Rome simply built another. Forests were stripped of timber. Bronze was repurposed for nails and fittings. Hundreds of new ships were commissioned. Oarsmen were trained. Officers reassigned. It was not brilliance. It was bureaucracy. It was the dull momentum of a republic that had turned logistics into a kind of weapon. By the end of the war, Rome had lost over 600 ships. Thousands of sailors and marines were buried at sea or washed ashore. The expense was enormous, the casualties staggering. But in the end, Rome had done something no one thought possible. It had outlasted Carthage. At the final battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, the Roman fleet, leaner, faster, and free of the corvus, defeated the Carthaginians decisively. The war was over. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. An unfinished transformation. But in many ways, Rome's transformation into a sea power was still incomplete. The navy, though effective, remained secondary to the legions. Naval officers had less prestige, funding fluctuated, and even after victory, Rome disbanded much of its fleet to save money. Yet something had changed culturally, politically, psychologically. Rome had built a navy, fought a global power, and won. It had crossed the sea, survived storms, defeated admirals, and established foreign garrisons. It had learned painfully, slowly, that maritime power was not just a necessity, but a requirement for empire. The sea, once feared, was now understood. But how deep did this understanding go? Did the Roman people, born from the soil and raised in the hills, truly internalize what it meant to command the waves? Or would the lessons of the First Punic War fade like so many things do, when peace becomes routine and war becomes memory? Rome had survived its first taste of war at sea, and more importantly, it had refused to lose. That refusal, the quiet, grinding resistance to failure, became the defining characteristic of Roman naval effort during the First Punic War. Not brilliance, not elegance, but a methodical, almost emotionless repetition. Build ships, train men, sail out, lose, rebuild. What's most revealing is how little the Roman mindset seemed to change with experience. Carthage approached naval warfare as an art, a craft honed through centuries of trade, colonization, and maritime diplomacy. Rome treated it like siegecraft, a set of problems to be solved with discipline, wood, bronze, and bodies. This was not a golden age of great admirals or stunning sea maneuvers. It was an age of trial, error, and unrelenting logistics. And of storms. Logistics of a wooden war. By the midpoint of the First Punic War around 250 BCE, Rome had become the most prolific shipbuilder in the Western Mediterranean. At its peak, the Republic was building and maintaining over 200 warships at a time, many of them large quinquiremes. Each ship required about 200 oarsmen and another 100 soldiers and officers. That meant at least 60,000 men were involved in crew operations alone, not counting those who built the ships, made the sails, forged the nails, packed the food, or wrote the manifests. The sheer scale of administration is worth pausing on. Each vessel required 25 tons of oak or pine, over 2 miles of rope, 5 sails of tightly woven linen, hundreds of iron nails and copper fittings, dozens of amphorae for storing grain, oil, and wine, daily rations of hardtack, salted fish, and vinegared water. The oars were crafted in matched pairs. The benches had to be aligned precisely to maintain rowing rhythm. Spare parts, rudders, anchors, mast rings were stored in port depots across Italy and Sicily. There were even specific officials assigned to ration tar and pitch for waterproofing. For a state that just a few decades earlier had never commanded more than a handful of river barges, this was astonishing. And yet it was all held together not by maritime tradition or seafaring genius, but by the relentless ticking of a bureaucratic clock. The lives of Roman oarsmen. Contrary to popular portrayals in modern fiction, most Roman naval rowers in the First Punic War were not slaves chained to their benches. They were citizens, often poor, serving their term of military duty. Training was repetitive. Rowers were taught stroke timing on dry land, sitting on long benches mimicking a ship's layout. Once at sea, the rowing rhythm was dictated by a hortator, a taskmaster who used a drum, chant, or shouted cadence to keep the oars synchronized. The work was grueling, 8 to 10 hours of rowing per day with breaks for basic meals. Saltwater sores were common. Cramped quarters meant disease spread quickly. Blisters were constant. Many could not swim, and few wore any form of protection beyond tunics. Oarsmen slept where they sat. They kept their belongings in small baskets tucked beneath the bench. When storms came, they often had no option but to keep rowing until ordered to secure the oars and pray for calm seas. They were not glorified. Their names are largely lost, but without them, the war would have ended in Carthaginian victory. The Second Fleet and the Second Disaster. After the failed invasion of Africa in 255 BCE, and the catastrophic loss of over 250 ships in a storm, Rome built again. This Second Great Fleet sailed cautiously. Patrols resumed. Convoys were more tightly managed. Carthaginian raids in Sicily were countered. But in 253 BCE, another storm struck, this time off the coast of Cape Palinurus. Historians estimate another 150 ships were lost. Again, it was not battle but nature that proved the greater enemy. And yet again, Rome responded not with withdrawal but with production. The state shifted shipbuilding contracts from inland cities to coastal ones for faster delivery. It improved road connections from forests to ports. It restructured supply chains to reduce the storage time of perishable goods. Minor officials were assigned major responsibilities, such as regulating how much wood could be cut without destabilizing riverbanks. The war had not yet been won, but the administrative backbone that would one day support a global empire was being constructed plank by plank, list by list. The slow siege of Drepana. One of the longest and least appreciated campaigns of the war centered around the port cities of Lilybaeum and Drepana on the western coast of Sicily. These cities, heavily fortified and resupplied by Carthaginian ships, resisted Roman assaults for years. Roman strategy focused on land sieges with limited naval blockades, but Carthage, using faster ships and more experienced sailors, continued to slip past the Roman lines. Attempts to starve the cities into submission failed. Then came the disaster at Drepana in 249 BCE. Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher, in a rush to score a decisive naval blow, sailed into battle without proper recon, weather awareness, or tactical planning. He brought 120 ships against a slightly smaller Carthaginian fleet and was outmaneuvered, outclassed, and crushed. 93 Roman ships were lost. It was one of Rome's worst naval defeats. Legend says that before the battle, Pulcher consulted the sacred chickens, a traditional Roman religious ritual. When the birds refused to eat, an ill omen, he threw them overboard, declaring, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The gods apparently were not amused. Pulcher was recalled, tried, and disgraced, but Rome did not abandon the war. The defeats were severe but not final. The lesson was clear. Impulsive heroism had no place in naval command. From here forward, Rome's approach would become even more cautious, more technical, more reliant on slow pressure than on dramatic risk. The sea had no patience for arrogance. Ports, repairs, and the mundane grind of war. While battles drew the headlines, most of Rome's naval efforts in these years were invisible to history: maintenance, repair, and routine. Every damaged ship had to be inspected, hulls were scraped of barnacles, leaks were sealed with pitch, sailcloth was rewoven, rations were packed, amphorae were cleaned and reused. Every season the cycle repeated. Men were rotated off ships for rest. New recruits were trained. Disease had to be managed: lice, typhus, intestinal infections. In storm season, ships were pulled into dry dock and turned on their side to inspect keel damage. Warehouses near ports became hubs of quiet activity: rope coiling, olive oil rationing, parchment copying, weapons counting. It is in these moments, the long days with no combat, just preparation, that the true scale of Rome's war effort becomes clear. Rome didn't just build ships, it built systems. And those systems, boring though they may seem, were what allowed the Republic to outlast an enemy born to the sea. Carthaginian strain. By the late 240s BCE, the war's strain was beginning to show not only in Rome, but also in Carthage. Carthage had relied heavily on hired troops: Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, who were growing restless. Funding the war became difficult. The government had to raise taxes on merchant elites, who in turn demanded faster resolutions and lower risks. Carthaginian admirals, wary of losing more ships, adopted defensive strategies. Rome, meanwhile, raised yet another fleet, this time privately funded. The state could no longer afford the cost directly, so wealthy citizens donated money to build ships, with the promise of future profits and political favor. This fleet, lean, carefully trained, and strategically focused, would win the war. But the path to that final battle at the Aegates Islands was not made of glory. It was made of procurement ledgers, oar drills, and sailors reheating lentils in iron pots. And in that mundanity lies the essence of Roman success. They learned not to rely on luck, not to count on heroism, but to prepare, to record, and to repeat. Again and again. An open sea, an unfinished lesson. By 243 BCE, Rome had gained the upper hand. The Carthaginian garrisons in Sicily were isolated. The new Roman fleet, faster and smarter, cut off supply routes. Carthaginian morale dipped. Mutinies among mercenaries were reported. Yet even with the war's end in sight, the Romans proceeded slowly. They did not rush the final blow. They fortified their bases, checked the tides, maintained the ships, trained the crews, all the same work again. Because by now, Rome had learned what the sea demanded: repetition, patience, and respect. But even so, even after building the greatest fleet in Roman history, after learning the rhythms of storm and strategy, one question remained. Would they keep the fleet? Or would they dismantle it again in peace? Would Rome remain a naval power, or would it drift back to land, only to return to sea again in crisis? By the spring of 241 BCE, the First Punic War had stretched into its 23rd year. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but war. Entire families had lost sons and fathers to the sea. Both Rome and Carthage were weary, drained not just of money and manpower, but of momentum. Sicily, the island that had triggered the conflict, was scarred with abandoned siege works, ruined farms, and coastal cities turned into floating garrisons. The Roman Senate, once flush with wartime enthusiasm, had become cautious. Treasury reserves were dangerously low. The state had already suffered at least 2 catastrophic naval disasters and countless setbacks on land. Many expected the war to end in a stalemate, an exhausted draw between 2 exhausted powers. And then quietly, Rome built one more fleet. But this time, they did it differently. A fleet without the state. The Republic could not afford another round of ships. The treasury was depleted. War taxes had reached their limit. Instead, a rare proposal was introduced. Let private citizens, particularly the equestrian, knight, class, finance the construction of a new naval force. Wealthy landowners, merchants, and political aspirants agreed. Ships were commissioned, supplies gathered, crews recruited. In return, these men would be repaid through spoils, influence, and commercial access once the war was won. In effect, it was the first privatized Roman navy. But unlike earlier fleets, this one was smaller, leaner, and more disciplined. The ships were lighter. The crews were better trained. The corvus, that heavy, top-mounted boarding bridge, was abandoned. It had served its purpose in Rome's early, inexperienced years. But now, with seasoned sailors and lighter ships, speed mattered more than artificial advantage. Rome was ready not just to fight at sea, but to sail at sea. The man behind the victory, Gaius Lutatius Catullus. In 242 BCE, the Senate appointed a relatively unknown consul, Gaius Lutatius Catullus, to command the new fleet. Unlike many of his predecessors, Catullus had no illusions of glory. He was an administrator, a coordinator, and it was precisely these skills that Rome needed. He established a blockade of the western tip of Sicily, focusing on 2 cities, Lilybaeum and Drepana. For months, the Roman fleet patrolled the waters, cutting off Carthaginian supply lines. Food shipments were intercepted, harbors were watched, even neutral traders were deterred. Then, in early 241 BCE, the opportunity came. Carthage, facing increasing unrest from unpaid mercenaries and food shortages in Sicily, sent a relief fleet from North Africa. It was hastily assembled. Many of the sailors were inexperienced. The ships were laden with supplies. Their mission was not battle but delivery. Catullus had no intention of letting them succeed. The Battle of the Aegates Islands. On March 10, 241 BCE, off the coast of the Aegates Islands, the 2 fleets met. Rome had 200 ships, Carthage about 250, though many were slower transport vessels. The Romans had spent months preparing. Their ships were lighter, their sails removed in anticipation of combat. Crews were trained, waters were familiar. The Carthaginians were burdened with cargo, surprised by Roman speed and outmaneuvered. The battle was swift and decisive. The Roman fleet closed in, ramming and boarding enemy vessels. Without the corvus, they relied on improved handling, timing, and the growing skill of their marines. Carthaginian ships were sunk or captured, supplies lost, morale shattered. It was the final blow Carthage could not absorb. With its last hope of resupply gone and rebellion stirring at home, Carthage sued for peace. The First Punic War was over. Rome had won not through brilliance, but through endurance. The peace and the price. The terms of peace were severe. Carthage agreed to surrender all claims to Sicily, pay a war indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, release all Roman prisoners without ransom, evacuate all garrisons in Sicily. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. But the cost of this victory in lives, ships, and sheer human effort was staggering. Historians estimate Rome lost over 600 ships during the war and up to 200,000 lives. many to drowning, disease, or starvation. The financial burden lingered for decades. For Carthage, the defeat marked a turning point. Though still a powerful trading empire, its reputation was damaged. Its reliance on mercenaries would soon backfire in a revolt known as the Mercenary War. Meanwhile, Rome had gained not only territory but experience and a taste for dominance. Yet even in triumph, Rome remained ambivalent about its fleet. After the war, most of the navy was disbanded. Ships were beached or decommissioned. Crews were released. The government, wary of naval expense in peacetime, returned to land-based priorities. It was a pattern that would repeat again and again. War, expansion, naval mobilization followed by neglect in peace. Rome had learned how to fight at sea. But had it learned how to sustain a navy? What the war revealed. The First Punic War was not merely a war over an island. It was a training ground for logistics, for naval administration, for political endurance. It revealed things about Rome that few could have predicted. That a landlocked republic could become a maritime power in less than a generation. That ordinary citizens could finance, crew, and maintain massive fleets through communal effort. That persistence, more than skill, was the key to maritime supremacy. It also showed the limits of tradition. Rome's reliance on heavy land tactics like the corvus had to evolve. Its bureaucratic instincts had to stretch beyond roads and rivers to tides and winds. Its commanders had to stop viewing the sea as foreign and begin viewing it as a battlefield with rules of its own. And they did. Slowly, deliberately, not through vision, but through repetition. The daily life of victory. The men who returned from the Aegates Islands were not all heroes. Many returned quietly, to farms and families, with no parades or lasting monuments. Sailors were given modest rewards. Some received land grants in Sicily or Italy. Others returned to their trades: carpenters, laborers, scribes. Their names are mostly lost, their stories buried in supply ledgers and casualty scrolls. But their labor reshaped a continent. The grain they protected would feed future legions. The routes they patrolled would become arteries of trade. The tactics they tested, boarding, blockading, convoying, would form the foundation of Roman naval doctrine for centuries. Even their mistakes, the storms, the overloaded decks, the careless commands became lessons, passed down in manuals, copied by scribes, argued in Senate debates. Victory in the Roman sense was not a moment, it was a process. A slow accumulation of systems, corrected errors, and lived experience. And in that process, the sea became just another frontier. Reflection: the sea as discipline. By the end of the First Punic War, Rome had learned something deeper than naval strategy. It had learned that discipline at sea, the same discipline that had won it victories on land, was possible. Not just the discipline of soldiers, but of systems. The discipline of measuring grain down to the last amphora. Of calculating the rowing cadence per league. Of writing orders in triplicate and posting them at every port. Of knowing when to build a bridge and when to leave it behind. The sea had forced Rome to adapt without changing its character. To become something new while remaining what it was. That, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of the First Punic War. Not the territory won, not the ships built, not even the battles. But the fact that Rome, a city of hills, fields, and rivers, became, through pure effort, a civilization capable of reaching across the water. One hesitant voyage at a time. Story 3. Corvus and Catastrophe, the rise and fall of Rome's first navy. Before Rome understood how to move with the sea, it tried to dominate it. The Roman corvus, a massive boarding bridge with a hooked spike at the end, became the symbol of this desire. It was not a subtle tool. It was not graceful. It turned nimble ships into floating siege platforms. It removed the agility of sea combat and replaced it with the violence of infantry shock tactics. In short, it made the sea behave like land. But the sea resented this, and it would respond. The need for control. When Rome entered the First Punic War in 264 BCE, it did so without experience in naval battles. Carthage, by contrast, had centuries of maritime tradition. Its sailors could navigate in open seas, execute complex maneuvers under pressure, and ram enemy vessels with a precision born from practice. Roman ships copied from Carthaginian designs were serviceable, but their crews were raw. Their officers, many from the senatorial class, had never fought at sea. The legions might dominate Sicily, but on water, Rome was awkward and exposed. A solution was needed, one that minimized seamanship and maximized Roman strengths. Thus, the corvus was conceived. Design and deployment. The corvus was a heavy, pivot-mounted gangplank, about 36 feet, 11 meters long and 4 feet wide. It was attached to the bow of Roman warships and fitted with a large iron spike, the beak at the end. When enemy ships drew near, the corvus would be swung outward and dropped onto the opposing deck, the spike driving into the planks to secure contact. Once attached, Roman marines would charge across, shields up, swords drawn, and engage in hand-to-hand combat. No longer did Rome need to master the ramming tactics or complex turns of traditional naval warfare. The sea battle became a land battle on wood. It was ingenious and terrifying. Polybius, writing a century later, described it with admiration. The corvus turned Rome's initial naval disadvantage into a formidable strength. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Gaius Duilius used it to seize over 50 Carthaginian ships. Rome's first naval victory was attributed directly to the boarding bridge. Other battles followed the same pattern. When enemy ships tried to circle or ram, Roman commanders waited. At just the right moment, the corvus fell, anchoring enemy ships and bringing them into the brutal range of the Roman infantry. Rome had, in effect, brought the battlefield with it. A tactical advantage becomes a strategic crutch. But advantages have weight, and the corvus was heavy, dangerously so. The bridge, its support structure, and the required hardware added significant mass to the front of the ship. This altered balance, slowed turning, and made ships vulnerable in strong wind and choppy seas. What had been a brilliant device in calm, coastal waters became a hazard in open sea. And still, the Romans persisted. They equipped nearly every warship with the corvus, even during long-distance campaigns. They viewed it as essential, not optional. It was their equalizer, their insurance policy, their floating rampart. To Roman commanders, naval strength still meant land-style dominance. But the sea would not be subdued so easily. Disaster in the wind. In 255 BCE, after an ambitious Roman campaign in North Africa ended in defeat, the Senate dispatched a massive evacuation fleet, over 350 ships, to retrieve the survivors. As the fleet set sail for home, it encountered a violent storm off the southern coast of Sicily. The corvus, with its high weight and poor aerodynamics, made the ships top-heavy and unwieldy. They did not ride the waves, they were swallowed by them. The wooden bridges twisted in the wind. Some snapped and tore apart their own decks. Others caused ships to capsize entirely. The result was catastrophic. Over 250 Roman vessels lost, and up to 100,000 men drowned, the single deadliest maritime disaster in Roman history. And yet the corvus remained. Bureaucracy over seamanship. Why? The answer lies not in strategy, but in administration. The Roman state was not nimble. It moved through consensus, precedent, and procedure. The corvus had worked. It had brought victory at Mylae, supported success at Sulci, and was baked into naval logistics. Shipbuilders now designed hulls to support its weight. Officers were trained with it in mind. Marines counted on it. To remove it would have required rethinking doctrine, a daunting task for a state still learning the sea. So instead, they continued as before. Ships were built with corvus, crews were drilled in their use, officers expected to rely on them. And storms continued to come. In 253 BCE, another storm struck. 150 more ships were lost. Again, the corvus was implicated. It wasn't until after the Battle of Drepana in 249 BCE, a stunning Roman defeat, in which no corvus could compensate for poor leadership and tactical blunders, that the Senate began to reconsider. Even then, the decision to phase out the boarding bridge came slowly, informally. There was no decree, no dramatic shift. The corvus simply appeared less often on new ships. Lighter vessels were favored. Training manuals began to focus more on rowing and turning. Commanders were advised to seek maneuver over brute force. Rome was learning not from innovation, but from failure. The psychology of the plank. The corvus tells us much about Roman thought. Where other naval powers emphasized agility, adaptation, and situational awareness, Rome prioritized control. It did not trust the fluidity of the sea. It sought to anchor the unpredictable to the stable, to turn every encounter into something it could dominate with discipline and steel. The corvus was not just a tool, it was a metaphor. It showed how Rome responded to unfamiliar environments, not with wonder but with architecture, not with improvisation but with imposition. And that approach worked until it didn't. Reflections at sea. Imagine for a moment a Roman sailor in those early years. He stands on the bow of a warship, the heavy corvus looming overhead. The iron beak creaks slightly in the wind. His ship rocks awkwardly on the waves. He cannot see the horizon clearly. The sea is restless, the sky darker than it should be. He knows the ship was never meant for storms. He knows the corvus is both shield and anchor, protection and risk. He cannot swim. And yet he rows. Because the orders have been given, the wood has been cut, the plan has been set in motion. This is how Rome sailed, with purpose, but not grace. An open question. By the time of the final Roman victory at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, the corvus had largely vanished from the fleet. Rome had adapted, out of necessity rather than choice. The Republic learned to build lighter ships, to train better sailors, to trust the tides instead of resist them. The age of the corvus passed not with ceremony, but with silence. But the question remains. Was the corvus a symbol of Roman genius or of its early blindness? Did it help Rome bridge the gap between land and sea, or delay the maturity of its naval identity? And in the broader story of empire, how often do tools of survival become anchors of limitation? The corvus began as a miracle. It was a ladder thrown across the sea, a physical manifestation of Rome's refusal to submit to foreign conditions. With it, a warship was no longer just a platform of sails and oars. It became a floating fortress, complete with an infantry assault bridge. And in the early battles of the First Punic War, it worked, dramatically. But over the following decade, as storm after storm claimed Roman lives and fleets, the once celebrated device became something else: a burden, a complication, a point of quiet, bureaucratic resistance. The corvus had helped build Rome's first navy. Now it threatened to drown it. A tactical crutch. After the victory at Mylae in 260 BCE, Roman confidence in the corvus grew. Commanders credited it for turning the tide of naval warfare. Morale soared. Officers requested it for every major warship, sometimes even smaller support vessels. Manuals were written describing the timing of its release, the positioning of infantry during boarding, and how best to spike the enemy's deck. Some scholars argue that by 257 BCE, Rome was entirely reliant on corvus-enabled victories. The ships themselves became more like troop transports than maneuverable war machines. Roman marines were trained as frontline legionaries, not naval raiders. They drilled in close formation on deck, waiting for the signal to cross the bridge. The enemy adapted. Carthaginian commanders, aware of the danger of being boarded, changed their approach. They used faster ships to flank Roman vessels, avoiding the corvus entirely. In open seas, they baited the heavier Roman ships into chasing, then turned, struck quickly, and retreated. Rome had altered the nature of naval warfare, but so had its opponents. And the sea, as ever, was still indifferent. Weight and water. The physics of the corvus were simple and problematic. Mounted at the prow, the 1.2-ton plank in its gear shifted the ship's center of gravity forward. When not deployed, it rested vertically or folded flat, rising like a mast or lying like a stubborn arm. The added weight made turning slower and destabilized the ship in rough water. More dangerously, it elevated the risk of capsizing when hit by strong waves. The extra top weight combined poorly with the flat-bottomed quinquereme hulls. In calm conditions, the corvus was a weapon. In storms, it was a death sentence. One Roman engineer, writing in fragments now lost but referenced later by Pliny the Elder, noted that a standard warship with a corvus required 12% more ballast and reinforcement than a standard trireme just to maintain balance in crosswinds. The sea, of course, did not adjust its temperament to accommodate these concerns. The slow erosion of trust. After the twin disasters of 255 and 253 BCE, both involving catastrophic storms that destroyed hundreds of corvus-equipped ships, questions began to circulate. But not publicly. Roman military culture did not reward second-guessing success. The corvus had brought victory. It was seen as Roman ingenuity, proof of superiority over maritime rivals. Still, the whispers grew louder. Some commanders requested the corvus only for frontline vessels. Others had them installed, but rarely used. A few daring consuls ordered them left ashore during storm season, or removed them entirely when sailing in winter months. But Rome had no standing naval doctrine, no admiralty, no central training academy, no standardized process across fleets. Decisions were left to individual commanders. Variations were wide, mistakes repeated. One officer's caution was another's arrogance. And the storms kept coming. Drepana, the death blow. In 249 BCE, Rome launched a new campaign to take the critical port city of Lilybaeum in western Sicily. A supporting fleet was to block Carthaginian supplies from sea, this time under the command of Publius Claudius Pulcher, a brash patrician from a prominent Roman family. Pulcher was young, ambitious, and confident. He brought with him a fleet of 123 warships, many of them equipped with corvi, despite increasing caution from naval advisors. The battle plan was simple: surprise the Carthaginians at the nearby port of Drepana before dawn. Pulcher hoped for a swift victory to break the siege. It went poorly from the start. The Carthaginian fleet, under the experienced Adherbal, spotted the Romans early. Their ships were already at sea, formed into a loose line. Pulcher's ships, emerging from the harbor in a long single file, were disorganized, unable to form ranks in time. The corvus, which required stable positioning and head-on approach, became useless. In the confusion, Carthaginian ships maneuvered around the Roman flanks. Lighter and faster, they rammed and retreated before Pulcher's ships could respond. Many of the Roman ships were so sluggish and so top-heavy that they could not even turn quickly to face the enemy. The result was devastating. 93 Roman ships lost, with thousands dead or captured. It was the worst Roman naval defeat at the hands of an enemy during the entire war. Pulcher returned to Rome in disgrace. He was tried, heavily fined and barred from future office. But more importantly, confidence in the corvus collapsed. The device, once celebrated, now symbolized overreach, hubris, and a failure to adapt. It was not formally banned, but quietly, ship by ship, dock by dock, it disappeared. Quiet abandonment. No senator declared the corvus obsolete. No edict removed it from Roman naval policy. It simply faded. Newer ships, those commissioned for the final years of the war, were built lighter, sleeker. Training shifted toward open-sea maneuvering. Sailors were drilled in turning, positioning, and speed. Marines were now expected to fight on board only when necessary, not by design. Rome had learned what Carthage already knew. The sea rewards movement, not mass. The final battle of the war, fought at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, was won by a fleet without corvée. The Roman ships were faster, the crews better trained. The engagement was not decided by boarding but by mobility and blockade. It had taken 20 years of war, thousands of lives, and hundreds of ships, but Rome had finally accepted that naval power required more than just land tactics on water. It required adaptation. Engineering versus environment. The story of the corvus is more than just a naval episode. It reflects a broader Roman instinct to solve new problems with familiar tools. Faced with the strangeness of the sea, the Romans did not first seek to understand it. They sought to dominate it. The corvus worked because it didn't ask the sea for permission. It imposed Roman values, discipline, directness, conquest onto a medium that resisted them. And it worked for a time. But nature does not negotiate. And while armies might be ruled by legions, the sea is ruled by wind, tide, and timing. Rome had to learn this painfully. The corvus was a bridge in every sense of the word from land to sea. It helped carry Rome across its early naval ignorance. But once the crossing was complete, it was no longer needed. In fact, it became dangerous to cling to it. In the wake of the Iron Beak, no remains of a corvus survive today. No shipwreck has yielded the iron spike, the pivot frame, or the long planks that once clattered down onto enemy decks. Wood rots, iron rusts, memory too fades. But the influence of the device lingers in history. The very term corvus became a kind of metaphor in Roman literature. It was occasionally used to describe a person or policy that seized too aggressively, that struck with weight rather than grace. Later naval thinkers, Byzantine, Venetian, even early moderns, studied the corvus as a curiosity. Few imitated it. Rome never used the device again after the First Punic War. They never had to. Once the Republic understood how to command the sea with movement rather than mass, the era of the boarding bridge ended. But it had done its job. It had allowed a landlocked republic, unsure and unskilled, to stand toe-to-toe with a maritime empire, to find its balance on a moving deck, to fall and rise again. By the end of the First Punic War in 241 BCE, the corvus had already become a relic not by decree, but by quiet abandonment. It was a rare instance in Roman history where a tactical innovation, once revered, faded not because it failed entirely, but because Rome evolved past it. And that evolution, though not always acknowledged in triumphant speeches or official records, marked the beginning of a new Roman mindset at sea. The corvus had served its purpose, but its story did not end with its final deployment. Its influence lingered in ship design, in Roman caution, and in the very infrastructure of an empire learning to live with the sea rather than fight against it. What was left behind? Physically, the corvus left no remains. No iron spike has been pulled from the depths. No pivot joints, no preserved planks. The Mediterranean, generous in its myths but stingy with its artifacts, has buried the boarding bridge beneath layers of sediment and silt. and yet its shadow endures in the written word. Polybius, Livy, and later historians described the device with a mixture of admiration and critique. They understood what it represented, not just a tactical answer, but a psychological bridge, one Rome desperately needed in its earliest maritime years. For the Roman soldier-sailor standing on the bow of a rolling quinquereme, the corvus was reassurance. It said, "You don't have to be a sailor to win here. Just hold your line. Just march forward." It offered familiarity amid uncertainty. That familiarity, that desire to make the unknown feel known, was deeply Roman. But so was the willingness to let go of what no longer served. The long-term effects on naval thought. After the First Punic War, the Roman Republic demobilized most of its fleet. With Carthage temporarily neutralized, there was no pressing need to maintain a large standing navy. Ships were decommissioned, some repurposed for trade, others left to decay in port. But the lessons of the corvus had already seeped into Rome's strategic imagination. Ship design began to prioritize stability over brute force. Later Roman vessels had broader hulls, more balanced weights, and focused more on endurance during long patrols and grain escorts than direct combat. Boarding remained part of Roman naval doctrine, but it became situational. Rather than building ships around the act of boarding, Rome began training its marines to seize opportunities as they arose, not to force them with oversized tools. Naval officers were expected to know the sea. Increasingly, consuls and praetors given fleet commands were selected not just for political status, but for logistical competence and observational skill. Seamanship was no longer dismissed as un-Roman. It was, quietly, becoming essential. In this way, the corvus became a chapter in Rome's long process of adapting its rigid, land-based strategies to the fluid, unpredictable nature of maritime warfare. Infrastructure, the lasting impact. Though the device itself disappeared, the system it necessitated endured. To support corvus-equipped fleets, Rome had built enormous naval workshops and dry docks along the western Italian coast. Towns like Ostia, Antium, and Cumae became centers of naval supply. Ramps, cranes, warehouses, and rope yards were constructed, many of them outlasting the war itself. Some of the ship designs introduced during the Corvus period remained standard for decades. The quinquereme itself, with its 5-oar banks and multi-level deck, continued as the preferred Roman warship until well into the late Republic. Even as lighter and faster ships were adopted, the framework built during those first decades of naval experimentation provided the backbone. And beyond the physical, the bureaucratic routines Rome developed during the Corvus years manifest documentation, ship maintenance schedules, grain calculation for long voyages, all became permanent parts of naval life. A boarding bridge had forced Rome to organize at scale. Even when the bridge itself vanished, the organization stayed. Psychological echoes, controlling the unknown. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Corvus was psychological. It revealed something about how Rome confronted unfamiliar threats, not by mimicking others, but by attempting to force its own systems onto new environments. Rome did not seek to sail like the Carthaginians. It sought to bring the legion to sea. It did not want to learn the rhythms of wave and wind. It wanted to control them. The Corvus was not innovation as exploration, it was innovation as containment. This mindset would reappear throughout Roman history. When facing nomadic horsemen in the east, Rome built static frontier walls. When encountering tribal societies in Gaul, it constructed grid-based cities. When facing new religions, it formed bureaucracies around temples. Rome's genius was not in adapting to the world, but in adapting the world to itself. And yet, eventually, Rome always had to meet the world halfway. The Corvus was an early lesson in that, a lesson in what happens when you carry the habits of land into the unpredictability of sea. fatting without shame. It's easy to frame the corvus as a crude contraption, abandoned in favor of more elegant solutions. But that view is incomplete. In truth, the corvus did its job. It gave Rome time to build ships, train sailors, establish ports, and experiment with control. Without it, Rome may not have survived its first decade of naval war. Its departure wasn't an admission of failure. It was an indication of growth. A civilization strong enough to invent something radical and mature enough to set it aside. That in itself is rare in history. Epilogue: the ship without the bridge. Imagine now a Roman warship built not in panic but in preparation. It sits low in the water, its hull well balanced, its sails trimmed, its deck free of awkward planks or heavy spikes. The oarsmen row in practiced rhythm. The Marines fewer now wait calmly, knowing that if battle comes, it will be swift and clean. There is no corvus on board. It is not needed. Because the ship, at last, is designed to move with the sea not against it. The Republic, too, is learning to trust in movement rather than domination. To act not as a guest in maritime affairs, but as a participant. To embrace uncertainty not fully, but enough. And the ghost of the corvus remains there in the stern of every Roman fleet that came after, not visible, but remembered. A silent reminder that empire is not built only on conquest, but on adaptation. Story 4. The Second Punic War, Hannibal and the Silent Ships. Before the hooves touched alpine snow, before the Senate trembled at the mention of Hannibal's name, and before Canna became synonymous with annihilation, there were ships. Not many, not fast, not glorious. But they moved. Quietly. The Second Punic War is often remembered as a land war, and rightly so. It brought some of the most devastating battles in ancient military history. Yet, while legions bled across Italy, and while Hannibal's march reshaped strategy forever, a less visible struggle was unfolding offshore in harbors, coastal towns, and along trade routes threading through the western Mediterranean. This was the war of silent ships, of scouting vessels, blockade runners, grain convoys, and naval silence that allowed audacity on land. To understand Hannibal's famous land campaign, one must first understand what the sea permitted and what it quietly prevented. The calm after catastrophe. The First Punic War had ended in 241 BCE. Carthage, defeated at sea and forced to evacuate Sicily, had learned a bitter lesson. Its navy, once unchallenged, had been humbled by Roman bureaucracy and endurance. In the years that followed, Carthage faced internal turmoil, the mercenary war, uprisings in its colonies, and the need to restore commercial routes that had been disrupted by 2 decades of conflict. Rome, for its part, maintained a modest fleet and focused on consolidating its new provinces. Neither side was eager for another naval war. And so, in the 230s and 220s BCE, the Mediterranean entered a tense, shallow peace like still water hiding a dangerous current. During this time, both Rome and Carthage restructured their naval logistics. Rome shifted focus to controlling coastal access in Sardinia and Corsica, maintaining garrisons and patrol fleets. Carthage expanded into Iberia, sending expeditions and establishing colonies to access silver mines and raise new armies. It was during these Iberian expansions that the Barcid family, most notably Hamilcar, and his son, Hannibal, began preparing the foundations of a conflict that would eventually challenge Rome's very survival. Hannibal's inheritance. When Hannibal Barca took command of Carthaginian forces in Iberia in 221 BCE, he inherited more than an army. He inherited a vision, his father's vision, of restoring Carthaginian dignity and confronting Roman dominance. But Hannibal was not reckless. He understood that Carthage could not match Rome ship for ship. The Carthaginian navy had never fully recovered. Its admirals were competent but cautious. Its shipyards were active but underfunded. Its vessels were excellent for trade protection but not for full-scale conflict. And so Hannibal, rather than plan an invasion by sea, looked inland. He turned toward the Alps. But even this land strategy depended on maritime silence. Hannibal needed Rome not to be watching. He needed the Roman navy to be occupied elsewhere, maintaining grain routes, guarding Sicily, responding to pirates in the Adriatic, and patrolling Sardinia. He needed to move supplies, messages, and agents by sea quickly, quietly. And he needed to distract Rome just long enough to make a move that no one would expect. The role of the Ebro River. In Hannibal's war preparations, the Ebro River in northeastern Spain became a vital artery, not just for land movement, but for its access to the Mediterranean coast. Through this river, Hannibal could send scouts and envoys by boat along the coast of Gaul, move small quantities of silver and supplies from the mines inland to ships at river mouths, establish relationships with coastal tribes who could serve as local suppliers and informants. Small Carthaginian ships built for speed and stealth, not warfare, hugged the Iberian coastline, sailing north into Ligurian territory, charting the terrain Hannibal would later march his army through. These were not battleships, they were messengers, but they laid the groundwork for an invasion. The Roman navy, meanwhile, was active but focused on other regions. Most of its patrol strength had been stationed in the central Mediterranean, maintaining security in Sicily and Sardinia. Spain, despite increasing Roman interest, was not yet fully monitored by Roman fleets. Hannibal took advantage of this blind spot. Rome's naval distraction, Sardinia and the Adriatic. While Hannibal consolidated power in Spain, Rome was busy elsewhere. Its navy, rebuilt in the aftermath of the First Punic War, was divided into regional squadrons. Sicilian fleet, based at Lilybaeum, responsible for patrolling grain convoys, especially from Africa. Sardinian squadron, tasked with guarding against piracy and local unrest. Adriatic patrols, guarding Illyrian coastlines and responding to raids from northern tribes. Tarentine detachment, small forces in the Ionian Sea to monitor Greek territories and respond to eastern movements. The fleet was spread thin. Its commanders reported routine matters: missing grain, captured pirates, minor skirmishes. Naval reports in the Senate were bureaucratic, not strategic. To Roman eyes, the sea was behaving. And so, with no obvious naval threats, Rome failed to recognize how much freedom this gave Hannibal's agents. They moved quietly along the coast. They made maps, they bought food, they spoke with traders, they watched Roman garrisons. The sea, so often a battlefield, had become a veil. The secret crossing, not just the Alps. The famous moment Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants is often told as a singular land story. But even this feat was supported by maritime movement. Carthaginian agents had traveled ahead of the army, sent by boat to Ligurian and Gallic tribes to secure guides, food, and local passage rights. Supplies for the Alpine crossing were partly gathered by ships ahead of time, moved up rivers and trails to staging points. Scouts traveled north by sea and returned with terrain details. Silver payments for tribal alliances were delivered in part by coastal supply ships. These were not Carthaginian fleets in formation. They were small, fast-moving units, galleys, cutters, merchant vessels operating just below Rome's line of sight. And once Hannibal's army descended into the Po Valley in 218 BCE, these early maritime efforts bore fruit. Rome had been caught by surprise. Naval hesitation. As Hannibal advanced into northern Italy, Rome responded slowly. Its naval command was still preparing for a war with Carthage in Spain or Africa. The main Roman fleet, under Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, was dispatched toward Spain, expecting Hannibal to remain there. When the news arrived that he had crossed the Alps, Roman strategy scrambled. Suddenly, the sea was no longer a forward front, it was a supply line in the rear. Fleets were repositioned, convoys rerouted. The Adriatic patrols were reinforced to prevent Carthaginian alliances with Illyrian tribes, but the damage was done. The silence at sea had allowed Hannibal to roar on land. A war unlike the last. The Second Punic War would not resemble the first. There would be no massive fleet battles, no corvus, no hundreds of ships ramming in formation. Instead, the sea would play a background role, constant, logistical, essential. Naval activity would consist of convoy escort of grain to starving Roman colonies and garrisons, transport of reinforcements to Spain and later North Africa, communication lines between provincial governors and Rome, blockades and port seizures, particularly around Tarentum and in the final campaigns in Africa. But the largest naval role, and the most overlooked, had already occurred. It had happened quietly in the decade before war began, when Rome assumed the sea was still. And in that stillness, the sea had given Hannibal cover. A question beneath the waves. As Rome's armies rushed to defend the north, and as Hannibal won his early victories, a question lingered in the minds of a few coastal commanders and Senate observers. Had they misunderstood the silence of the sea? Had Rome grown complacent, mistaking calm for control? In the years to come, the sea would once again become vital. Fleets would rebuild. Convoys would decide fates. But in these earliest days, before elephants marched and legions mobilized, the sea had played its own game. Invisible, unclaimed, and devastatingly silent. By 217 BCE, Hannibal was loose in Italy. The Alps had been crossed, the Roman countryside burned. Battles at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene had stunned the Republic, and with each Carthaginian victory, Rome's sense of invincibility frayed. Yet through it all, through fire, fear, and mounting losses, the Roman homeland did not starve, collapse, or riot. Why? Because the seas, though far from silent now, were still held. Rome's navy, battered and reduced after the First Punic War, had not vanished. Though it was not at the center of glory or story, it was the invisible scaffolding holding the Republic together. The ships didn't win battles, but they kept Rome fed. The grain lifeline, the most urgent maritime task during the Second Punic War, was not hunting Carthaginian fleets or attacking ports, it was feeding the people. With Hannibal ravaging Italian farmland and interrupting domestic agriculture, Rome's grain supply shifted increasingly to Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, especially after certain Numidian factions allied with Rome. Ships were constantly dispatched to ferry grain across the Mediterranean to Roman ports. This required convoy organization, naval escorts, port inspections, dockside rationing. The job was not glamorous. There were no triumphs for securing a month's worth of barley, no statues for quartermasters. Yet without these ships, the city of Rome, already stretched thin by refugees, economic panic, and conscription, would have faced starvation. Each vessel that arrived safely was a small victory, and thousands of such victories occurred in quiet succession. Naval garrisons and port control. Rome also began strengthening its coastal defenses and harbor patrols in response to the psychological effect of Hannibal's land victories. There was constant fear that Carthage would land a second army, perhaps in the south of Italy, or near Tarentum, or in Etruria. Roman commanders did not believe Hannibal acted alone, and while a major seaborne invasion never came, the threat shaped strategic deployment. Tarentum, a vital southern port, was garrisoned and supplied by sea. Ostia, the port of Rome, remained guarded year-round. Brundisium, on the heel of Italy, became an active naval base for watching Greek and Illyrian activity. Roman fleets patrolled the coasts not to fight, but to prevent fighting, to detect landings, protect ports, and deter Carthaginian raids. And it worked. Carthage lacked the maritime resources to mount a coordinated naval invasion of Italy. The Roman navy, spread thin but disciplined, ensured that this remained the case. Hannibal would have to rely on the resources he brought or could take from Italy itself. Reinforcements from overseas, particularly those promised from Carthage, were delayed, intercepted, or denied. The navy had become a wall. Naval officers without glory. Naval command during the Second Punic War was rarely celebrated. Consuls and legates who fought on land were memorialized in funeral speeches, commemorated in stone. Naval commanders, meanwhile, managed slow, logistical operations. They received reports on grain shortages, requests for ship repairs, complaints about stolen cargo, instructions to wait in harbor until further orders. A few names survive, like Marcus Valerius Levinus, who commanded naval forces in the east, but most went unrecorded. They operated in the background. One such commander, whose name is lost but is known through fragments of correspondence, spent nearly 2 years maintaining a supply chain from Sicily to Tarentum. His fleet lost only 4 ships during that time, all to weather, not combat. His success ensured the survival of Roman forces in the south. He received no triumph, no poem, just a small pension and an entry in the naval log. This was the nature of Rome's navy during this phase, unseen and uncelebrated, but indispensable. The Carthaginian dilemma. Carthage, too, understood the sea's value and its own growing limits. Its navy had never fully recovered from the First Punic War. Though it retained excellent shipbuilding traditions and skilled seamen, it struggled with scale, and more importantly, it struggled with coordination. Hannibal, despite his brilliance, operated independently. His communications with Carthage were intermittent. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered. His brothers in Spain, Hasdrubal, and Africa, Mago, required their own fleets for defense. Unlike Rome, Carthage did not have a unified maritime command structure. Admirals had autonomy. Merchant lobbies held power. Political infighting diluted naval funding. Many in Carthage's ruling elite remained reluctant to commit major ships to Italian waters, fearing Roman retaliation at sea. The result, the ships did not come. There would be no second army landing in Etruria, no vast Carthaginian fleet to strike at Rome's undefended coast. Hannibal would fight alone, and the Roman navy, though quiet, had helped guarantee that. A subtle strategy. Some modern historians refer to this phase of the war as Rome's naval shadow strategy. While the legions lost on land, the navy quietly choked Carthaginian resupply lines, secured island grain flows, delivered troops and messages to key allies, transported gold and tax revenues, maintained Roman presence in eastern diplomacy. Even Scipio Africanus, still young and without command, observed this naval discipline firsthand. He would later use the navy with great effectiveness, but only because the infrastructure already existed. This strategy wasn't reactive, it was patient, passive. It was Rome holding the sea while losing the land. And it bought time to train new legions, to raise taxes, to build new alliances. Time to survive. A war without fleets. It is striking that the Second Punic War, fought between 2 former naval powers, included no major sea battles for over a decade. Instead, the sea became a logistical corridor, a channel of movement and delay, a backdrop to the real drama, but no less essential. The sea allowed legions to be moved from Spain, reinforcements to reach Africa, sabotage missions to be launched from Italy to Greek allies. propaganda to flow in the form of coin shipments, letters, diplomatic envoys. The absence of naval glory does not mean the sea was inactive. It means the sea was secure. And security in war is its own kind of victory. The sea after Cana. Even after the disaster at Cana in 216 BCE, perhaps the most shattering Roman defeat in history, the sea remained loyal. No Carthaginian fleet sailed into the Tiber. No supply lines were severed. Rome's allies overseas continued to send goods, food, and money by ship. Even under the weight of loss, the Roman navy did not collapse into panic. Instead, Ostia remained open. Convoys continued from Sicily and Sardinia. Diplomats arrived by boat. There was fear in the forum, but not famine in the harbor. And that made all the difference. A reflection on boredom and discipline. Rome's success at sea during the Second Punic War was not heroic. It was administrative. Grain manifests kept up to date. Rotas for oarsmen enforced. Harbor logs copied twice, once for Rome, once for the province. Watchtowers maintained, even in snow or rain. Ship maintenance crews rotated quarterly. It was the kind of war effort that earns no statues, but wins endurance. The kind that lets a city lose half its armies and still function. Still feed its people. Still fight back. Hannibal was brilliant. But brilliance alone cannot starve a well-fed city. By 210 BCE, Rome had not won the war. But it had not lost it either. And that fact alone was remarkable. Hannibal had scorched Italian soil for nearly a decade. Cities had fallen, allies had defected, armies had been slaughtered, but still Rome stood. Still it raised taxes. Still it called legions to muster. And still, perhaps most importantly, ships docked daily at Roman ports. The sea remained Roman. That quiet fact, unnoticed by poets and chroniclers, would become the lever Rome used to shift from survival to supremacy. And it began with a man who had grown up watching those uncelebrated ships move through Ostia, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. Scipio's maritime pivot. When Scipio assumed command in Hispania in 210 BCE, the tides, both literal and figurative, began to change. Unlike previous generals who treated the navy as auxiliary, Scipio saw it as a strategic instrument. He reorganized supply chains, rebuilt harbors, repaired neglected warships, and began using naval units to conduct surprise attacks and amphibious operations, techniques previously rare in Roman doctrine. His early victories in Spain, including the dramatic capture of Carthago, Nova New Carthage, depended not only on land tactics but also on naval coordination. Troops were delivered by ship, avoiding overland ambushes. Supplies were shuttled rapidly up the Iberian coast. Reconnaissance teams scouted from sea inlets and lagoons. Carthaginian commanders, slow to adjust, found themselves outmaneuvered. The Mediterranean, which Hannibal had once counted on as a logistical shield, now became a Roman highway. Rome's naval expansion, 208-204 BCE. By 208 BCE, Rome was no longer merely defending its shores. It was projecting naval power into enemy territory. This phase included a revitalized fleet of quinquiremes built with improved ramming capabilities, maritime blockades of Spanish and North African ports, particularly around Gads and Utica, rapid supply convoys moving between Sicily, Iberia, and southern Italy, naval diplomacy, using ships to send envoys and secure support from Greek and Numidian allies. This expansion was not sudden. It was the cumulative result of years of maritime discipline, shipbuilding investment, and logistical learning. And it came just in time. Because in 204 BCE, Rome made its most audacious move, yet one that would finally shake Hannibal loose from Italy. Scipio would invade Africa. Operation Africa, the Silent Armada. Scipio's invasion of North Africa in 204 BCE required one of the most logistically complex naval operations in Roman history up to that point. It involved over 400 ships, including transports, escorts, and war galleys, thousands of infantry and cavalry, loaded with arms, tools, and food, prepositioned supply depots on Sicily and Malta, coordinated timing between fleet movements and land maneuvers. The fleet departed from Lilybaeum, western Sicily, and crossed to the African coast largely unopposed. Carthage had failed to secure sufficient naval forces to intercept it. The once feared Carthaginian navy had become a shadow of its former self. The result: Scipio landed almost without resistance. It was a naval victory without a sea battle. And it marked the beginning of the end. Hannibal's recall and the last naval motions. Faced with Roman armies in Africa and rising Numidian hostility, Carthage recalled its greatest general, Hannibal. The man who had crossed the Alps, triumphed at Cannae, and haunted the Roman imagination for nearly 2 decades now returned home. But he did not ride overland. He sailed. The journey was hasty, disjointed. Carthage could only spare a small number of ships to bring his reduced force across the Mediterranean. Many troops had to be re-equipped on arrival. Coordination with local garrisons was rushed. Had the Carthaginian navy been stronger, had it been able to deliver men, food, and gold to Italy across the years, Hannibal's war might have ended differently. Instead, he faced Scipio at Zama in 202 BCE with fewer men and less support than he had ever commanded before. The battle ended in Roman victory. But long before swords clashed in Africa, the sea had turned. Post-war naval realities. The Treaty of 201 BCE imposed harsh restrictions on Carthage's military, especially its navy. Carthage was allowed only 10 warships. It could not rearm without Roman approval. It was forced to pay war indemnities that drained shipbuilding funds. It ceded Spain, and with it, its access to much of the Atlantic trade. Rome, by contrast, emerged with a blue-water navy capable not only of defending the peninsula, but of launching expeditions abroad. The age of maritime Roman dominance had begun. But it had not started with glory. It had started with paperwork, patrols, and the discipline of survival. The legacy of the Quiet Sea. Today, the Second Punic War is remembered for boldness, for Hannibal's elephants, for Scipio's counterattacks, for battles that shattered entire legions. But beneath the drama, a quieter story pulses. A story of mid-level naval officers cataloging sails in Tarentum, crews rowing grain across stormy straits from Sardinia, quartermasters checking olives and wine for spoilage in Ostia, shipwrights hammering outhull patches in Iberian coves, signal fires burning through misty nights on the hills above Brundisium. These were not scenes of heroism, but they were scenes of continuity. And in war, especially a war of years, not weeks, continuity is more powerful than courage. Reflection: the power of the unremarkable. What did Rome learn from this war? It learned that discipline outlasts genius, that logistics outmaneuver tactics, that a grain ship docking on time can be more important than a cavalry charge at dusk. And so, while Hannibal won hearts, Rome won harbors. It turned the Mediterranean from a contested sea into a Roman Lake Mare Nostrum, not through decisive sea battles, but through decades of consistent, methodical control. The war began with silence on the water, and it ended with ships not in battle but in motion, ferrying home a new empire. Story 5: Sicily between empires, naval chess in the Middle Sea. Sicily does not shout. It does not storm into history with elephants or invasions. It does not bear the names of famous generals with glorious deaths, but in the years following the First Punic War and throughout the Second, this island became the quiet center of everything. Sicily was not Rome's first conquest, but it was its first colony. And more importantly, it was the first test of Roman control across the sea. The transition from Punic to Roman hands. The Treaty of Lutatius in 241 BCE, ending the First Punic War, formally handed much of western Sicily to Rome. Carthage was forced to evacuate cities like Lilybaeum and Drepanum, ports it had held for generations. Rome, unfamiliar with maritime governance, inherited an island that had once been a Punic stronghold, a Greek outpost, and a battlefield all at once. The cities were fortified, the people divided, and the culture layered with foreign rulers. But Rome was not here to be cultural, it was here to feed itself. And so, logistics became policy. Sicilian grain, the empire's early lifeblood. With Italy's agriculture prone to seasonal disruption and wartime pillaging, Rome turned to Sicily for stability. By the early 2nd century BCE, Sicily was producing and shipping more grain to Rome than any other province, a flow so critical that the island's harvest schedule became synchronized with the Roman grain dole. To make this work, Rome had to do something it had never done before: manage ports, estates, roads, and storage depots on foreign land. Key developments included the creation of the Praetorship of Sicily, an administrative role with military and economic duties. Granaries constructed near major harbors like Syracuse, Lilybaeum, and Agrigentum. Road-building campaigns to connect inland farms to coastal towns. Naval convoys escorted from Sicilian ports directly to Ostia, bypassing pirate-infested channels. And at the center of all this, ships. Dozens of them. Ferrying sacks of barley, amphorae of oil, crates of dried fish. Rarely mentioned in histories. Always present in consequence. Syracuse, a city on the edge. Among Sicily's many cities, Syracuse stood apart. It was not a mere subject town, it was a Hellenistic kingdom with its own navy, coinage, and scientific tradition. Though it had aligned with Rome after the First Punic War, it remained culturally independent and politically cautious. For 2 decades, Syracuse observed. It sent grain to Rome, maintained a diplomatic distance, and allowed Roman ships to use its port but never truly yielded sovereignty. This uneasy alliance would not last forever. But in these early years, Syracuse became a strange blend of Greek autonomy and Roman dependence. Its harbors swelled with Roman convoys, its shipyards repaired Roman hulls, its merchants earned coin from the Republic. And its mathematician Archimedes remained at work, sketching strange machines in silence, unaware of the future siege to come. Naval infrastructure and security. To protect Sicily's growing role as a logistical hub, Rome maintained a rotating naval presence around the island. These were not fleets designed for combat, but for constancy. Light patrol ships circled the coast for pirates. Troop transports ferried garrisons from Italy. Watchtowers and signal stations were erected on promontories, enabling ships to communicate visually with land-based units. Small flotillas were stationed in Lilybaeum, poised to intercept Carthaginian agents or raiders from North Africa. This low-intensity naval architecture did not appear on Roman monuments. There were no sea battles to commemorate. But it was perhaps the first example of Roman naval policing, a practice that would later evolve into full-scale imperial maritime security. Sicily was both a test case and a training ground. Cultural boredom and bureaucratic success. If Sicily was the empire's stomach, it was also its filing cabinet. The administration of Sicily introduced Roman officials to the idea of provincial taxation, contracting grain transport to private shippers, and standardizing harbor tolls. This meant more than laws. It meant naval manifests copied in triplicate, ship weights and cargo verified by magistrate, port officials trained to read Latin and Greek, bribes recorded, sometimes even taxed. A Roman bureaucrat arriving in Syracuse or Panormus would not find glory. He would find paperwork. But that paperwork, handled correctly, ensured the fleets at sea had supplies, and that those supplies reached the armies that would one day win Rome an empire. A ticking clock, the rise of Hannibal. Back on the mainland, Hannibal was growing. By 218 BCE, Carthage's young general had crossed into Spain and would soon make his famous march toward the Alps. Rome did not yet know what was coming, but Sicily was already preparing. Shipbuilding quotas were raised. Sicilian ports were surveyed for potential troop embarkation. Stockpiles were quietly moved inland, away from vulnerable coastal towns. And Roman naval officers, usually relegated to dull patrols and tax collection, were given new orders. Keep the sea lanes clear. Keep the grain moving. Watch Syracuse. The calm before the storm had begun. And Sicily, never the storm itself, would once again be at the storm's center. By 214 BCE, the uneasy alliance between Rome and Syracuse had ruptured. The death of King Hiero II, who had long maintained peace with the Romans, opened a power vacuum in the ancient Sicilian city. His successor, the young and inexperienced Hieronymus, aligned himself with Carthage. Whether by youthful ambition or political persuasion, the result was unmistakable. Syracuse turned hostile. To Rome, this was more than a betrayal. It was a strategic emergency. Syracuse had long been the anchor of Sicily's eastern coast, a vital harbor and fortified city. If it were to fall into Carthaginian hands, it would become a base for enemy operations across the central Mediterranean. And so, in the shadow of the Second Punic War, Rome began a naval siege, one of the most complex maritime operations of its time. The Roman fleet assembles. The man chosen to lead the siege was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a seasoned general with a reputation for resolve and discipline. His first move was not a charge, it was a blockade. The Roman fleet, drawn primarily from Sicily's western ports and supported by reinforcements from Brundisium and Ostia, surrounded Syracuse by sea. Warships patrolled the harbor mouths to cut off supply routes. Transport ships brought siege equipment and fresh troops. Smaller craft watched the coastline for signs of reinforcement or escape. The goal was to strangle the city, not storm it, at least not yet. Rome had learned from previous campaigns that a patient blockade could be as effective as direct assault if the sea was controlled. In this they excelled. The genius of Archimedes. But Syracuse had a weapon Rome had not expected. A man, old, unarmed, and brilliant. Archimedes. Though he had no military title, Archimedes was the heart of Syracuse's defense. Using his knowledge of geometry, physics, and mechanical design, he crafted war machines that stunned Roman commanders. Among the defenses, catapults of varying range, calibrated using mathematical formulas for arc and distance. Stone throwers that could target approaching siege towers from elevated battlements. Iron claws or grappling cranes, long mechanical arms that would reach down from the walls, hook enemy ships, and lift them out of the water before smashing them against the rocks. Rotating mirrors or polished shields, allegedly used to set sails aflame with focused sunlight, though this remains debated. Roman sailors approaching the walls were met not just with arrows, but with impossible geometry levers, pulleys, and counterweights operating in perfect silence until suddenly unleashed. To the Romans, it seemed that Syracuse was fighting with the gods' tools. Naval frustration and persistence. The Roman navy, built for combat and control, found itself suddenly outmaneuvered by engineering. Ships approaching the sea walls were picked apart by projectiles. Troop barges were overturned by hidden levers and underwater booms. Sailors panicked at the strange devices emerging from towers and parapets. But Rome did not retreat. Instead, they adapted. Ships were refitted, with higher wooden covers to shield against vertical attacks. Patrols were set farther from the shore, to avoid the range of Archimedes' engines. Land-based siege lines were extended to prevent supply runs from inland routes. A dual siege emerged land and sea, synchronized but separate, requiring constant logistical coordination. This was not conquest. It was containment. And for 2 years Syracuse held the role of supplies and patience. Throughout the siege, Rome's navy played a role more vital than combat: supply maintenance. The longer the siege lasted, the more important it became to maintain a regular grain supply for Roman troops encamped around the city, keep a cordon around the harbor, blocking any attempted breakout, ensure that communication between Roman forces across Sicily remained uninterrupted. This required dozens of ships doing nothing but waiting crews who never fired a weapon, but who stayed in formation through storms and long summers. They recorded winds, monitored sails on the horizon, and watched. Their boredom was their service, because even Archimedes could not invent a machine to break a patient siege. The fall of Syracuse. In 212 BCE, after 2 years of siege and sabotage, Rome found its opening. A traitor, likely a disgruntled Syracusan, or a paid agent, opened one of the inland gates. Marcellus sent his legions through the breach. The city fell quickly. Archimedes, reportedly engrossed in geometric diagrams on the ground, was killed by a Roman soldier who did not recognize him. His death became a symbol of the cost of war on brilliance. But Rome had little time for mourning. The harbors had to be secured, the granaries inspected, the ships rerouted. With Syracuse under Roman control, the entire island of Sicily was now solidly within the Republic's grasp. The sea lanes reopened this time, entirely Roman. Strategic consequences. The fall of Syracuse and the control of Sicilian waters had several far-reaching outcomes. Carthage lost any realistic hope of using Sicily as a launchpad for reinvasion or maritime harassment. Rome gained a fortified central Mediterranean base to resupply forces in Iberia and later, Africa. The Roman navy, having managed the longest coordinated blockade in its history, now possessed the discipline and experience needed for prolonged maritime operations. Sicily's grain flow increased dramatically, not just supporting Rome, but fueling the next wave of Roman expansion. In short, Syracuse was the pivot, the moment when Sicily stopped being a borderland and became a heartland of the Roman Mediterranean. And it was won not by naval battles, but by unrelenting sea presence. Boredom, brutality, and the machines of war. Today, the siege of Syracuse is often remembered for Archimedes. But beneath the stories of mirrors and catapults lies a simpler truth. It was Roman persistence, not invention, that won the siege. It was the ships boring, waiting, circling that made escape impossible. It was the grain logs, the port inspections, the weather reports, and the harbor watch rotations that strangled the city. Archimedes may have repelled ships, but he could not repel time. After the fall of Syracuse in 212 BCE, a new phase of Sicilian history quietly began. There were no celebrations in Rome, only reports. Ship manifests, grain tallies, garrison assessments. The siege had been brutal. The war with Carthage continued elsewhere. But now, the island that had once divided empires was firmly in Roman hands. And Rome did not let go. Instead, it reorganized, recalibrated, and rebuilt. because Sicily, now subdued, was not just a province. It was a keystone, reconstructing the island economy. War leaves messes, and Sicily was full of them. Syracuse's population had shrunk, fortifications were damaged, rural farms had been burned or abandoned. The island's eastern coast, once humming with trade, was quiet. Rome responded with governance. New provincial administrators were appointed praetors with civil, military, and judicial authority. Confiscated land, especially from pro-Carthaginian factions, was redistributed or rented to Roman citizens. Major port cities were rebuilt with Roman standard infrastructure, paved roads to harbors, expanded docks, and fortified granaries. A formal tax system was imposed, including the decuma, a 10% grain tax to be paid directly to Rome. The goal was not merely control. It was sustainable exploitation. The Roman Republic didn't need Sicily to flourish culturally. It needed it to produce food, transport it efficiently, and remain secure while doing so. And that meant one thing: ships. Maritime bureaucracy, the birth of Roman naval routine. In the years following the siege, Sicily became the epicenter of Roman maritime logistics. While naval battles faded from memory, a new kind of naval activity emerged: organized, perpetual movement. The system looked something like this. Harvest collection, Sicilian estates, latifundia, many owned by absentee Roman elites, harvested wheat and barley. Local magistrates documented yields and reported to the provincial praetor. Port assembly, grain was carted by road or mule to major ports: Lilybaeum, Panormus, Syracuse, and a newly developed port at Messana. There, it was stored in Horia, official Roman granaries. Fleet coordination. The Roman Navy, in collaboration with civilian shipping contractors Publicani, arranged for convoys to depart at scheduled intervals. These fleets often sailed with military escort, even in peacetime. Sea transit. Grain ships moved north to Ostia, the port of Rome, and to Puteoli in the Bay of Naples. Some were rerouted to supply legions in Hispania or Africa. Inspection and audit. Upon arrival, shipments were recorded, weighed, and taxed. Naval officers and customs clerks managed the ports. This was no longer the age of maritime adventure. This was the age of maritime administration. And it worked. Sicily as a naval depot. Aside from grain, Sicily became a staging point for Roman military campaigns. Shipyards in Lilybaeum and Messana were expanded to build and maintain Roman vessels. Supply depots stockpiled timber, rope, sailcloth, olive oil, wine, dried legumes, and salted meat, all necessary for naval campaigns. Legionary transport from Italy to North Africa now routinely stopped in Sicilian ports for repairs, restocking, and rotation. By 200 BCE, Sicily could outfit and resupply a fleet within a matter of weeks. This meant that even when Rome sent forces to Spain or Greece, Sicily remained the first link in the supply chain. It was not glamorous, but it was critical. Pirates and protection. With increased traffic came increased risk. The Sicilian straits, the narrow waters between Messana and Rhegium, became a favorite hunting ground for pirates and rogue sailors. Rome responded not with grand naval campaigns, but with standardized patrol routes. Light triremes stationed at Syracuse, rotating weekly between Messana and the Aeolian Islands. Naval lookouts placed in towers along the northeast coast. Communication beacons lit at dusk to signal the passage or delay of Roman convoys. These measures did not eliminate piracy, but they made it costly and dangerous. Once again, Rome wasn't aiming for complete control. It was aiming for predictable functionality. Cultural effects of naval integration. While Rome had no initial interest in Sicilian culture, integration occurred anyway, particularly in the ports. Latin became the language of dock records, contracts, and tax reports. Roman coinage replaced Greek drachmas in official use. Veteran sailors and soldiers settled near harbors, marrying into local families. Roman architectural styles appeared in port warehouses, customs houses, and naval headquarters. And yet, despite this Romanization, Sicily retained a distinct identity. Greek temples still stood. Local dialects endured. Syracuse's libraries reopened, and philosophical schools resumed teaching. Rome allowed this, even encouraged it, so long as the grain flowed, and the ships ran on time. The long view: Sicily's role in the Republic. By the end of the Second Punic War in 201 BCE, Sicily was no longer a contested space. It was a naval asset secured not by fleets of war, but by a fleet of purpose. And over the next century, that role would expand. During the Macedonian Wars, Sicily served as a launch point for eastern campaigns. In times of famine, it became Rome's breadbasket, responsible for a third of the city's grain. When the Republic struggled to feed growing urban populations, Sicilian governors were judged almost entirely on the smoothness of grain exports. Sicily had become part of Rome's bloodstream. And it got there not through conquest alone, but through maritime infrastructure, consistency, and paperwork. Final reflection: empire on quiet waters. There is no famous naval battle off the coast of Sicily in the late 3rd century BCE. No dramatic sea victory like Actium. No desperate naval ambush like Mylae. But there were ships, thousands of them, ferrying barrels, bags, messages, and men. There were sailors who never saw battle, but kept Rome alive with steady oars. There were bureaucrats who measured grain, checked hulls, and approved manifests that would feed millions. And there was an island, hot, dusty, layered with cultures, that became a pivot of empire without a single monument to declare it. Sicily, in the end, did not win wars, but it allowed Rome to win them. Quietly, persistently, by sea. Story 6. The Lusitanian Sea Lanes, Rome's forgotten Atlantic frontier. There are maps that end in fog. For the ancient Romans, the western coast of Iberia, the region the Greeks called Lusitania, was one such place. Not unknown exactly, but uncertain. Here, where the Atlantic crashed against unyielding cliffs, and where the sun vanished into ocean mists, Rome encountered a frontier that defied its usual patterns. There were no great cities to siege, no central ports to occupy, no deep harbors teeming with trade. And yet the region mattered. It was the place where sea met silver, where river mouths led to hill forts, and where even Rome's most disciplined legions had to wait for weather and tides before advancing. This is the story of how Rome extended its maritime reach westward, not with fleets of war, but with measured persistence, coastal mapping, and an evolving understanding of the Atlantic. First contact: traders, scouts, and storms. By the late 3rd century BCE, Rome had established dominance over the central Mediterranean. It had taken Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and much of Iberia's eastern coastline after defeating Carthage in the Second Punic War. But the Atlantic edge, modern-day Portugal and parts of Galicia, remained a mystery. Greek merchants had sailed there centuries earlier. Carthaginians had built outposts near Gadir, modern Cadiz, but neither had fully subdued or mapped the winding estuaries and harsh granite coasts further north. Rome sent traders first, then scouts, and then very cautiously ships. The early Roman approach was quiet, commercial, and tentative. Merchant vessels navigated slowly, hugging the shorelines and avoiding open sea, always watching the horizon for storms. They learned to read the Atlantic differently than the Mediterranean. Tidal shift that stranded ships. Sudden weather fronts that could flatten a mast in minutes. Coastal shoals and underwater rock formations, invisible in calm seas. There was no naval conquest here, only navigation by patience. Lusitania, not quite a province. When Rome spoke of Lusitania in the early 2nd century BCE, it was more a region than a province. Populated by diverse tribal groups, the Lusitani, Terguli, Vetans, it was a land of hilltop fortresses, seasonal migrations, and fierce independence. The coast, dotted with small river inlets and natural coves, did not lend itself to large port construction. Rome had to adapt. It established temporary anchorage points, not true ports, but usable harbors in fair weather at sites like the mouth of the Tagus River, near modern Lisbon, Bracara Augusta further north, as a land base supporting coastal logistics, Alessippo, a small but useful anchorage that would later become a central hub. Each of these sites served the same quiet purpose: to test the waters, to gauge whether Rome could operate and profit on the ocean's edge. They didn't declare provinces. They declared presence. Shipping without infrastructure. One of Rome's greatest challenges in Lusitania was the lack of built harbors. In the Mediterranean, Rome relied on pre-existing Phoenician and Greek infrastructure: deep ports, stone quays, warehouses, shipyards. In the West, they had to start from nothing. This meant ships dropping anchor and ferrying goods ashore via smaller dinghies. Soldiers and sailors building wooden piers during temporary stays. Supply caravans marching inland from beachheads, often with no roads to follow. Tides dictating every operation, a foreign rhythm for men used to calm Mediterranean basins. Rome quickly realized that any military operation in the region required maritime stability first. Before conquering the people, it had to learn to dock. Naval cartography and the Atlantic mystery. The exploration of the Lusitanian coast led to one of Rome's lesser-known innovations: Atlantic coastal mapping. Roman scribes and engineers, sailing alongside small fleets, began compiling charts that described the shape of the coastline in linear detail, the strength and direction of tides at various lunar phases, seasonal storm patterns, especially in late autumn, the location of navigable rivers and their depth during different months. These documents rarely survive, but references to them appear in later Roman authors, particularly Pliny the Elder and Pomponius Mela. And while not military maps, they were vital to Roman strategy. Because in Lusitania, success was not measured in victories, but in continued return voyages. A single shipwreck could mean the loss of a season's tax revenue, or an entire battalion's worth of provisions. Mapping in this context was not science. It was security. Atlantic timber and Roman shipbuilding. One of the unexpected discoveries along the western Iberian coast was timber-thick, durable trees that Roman shipbuilders quickly came to value. In particular, cork oak and holm oak, both valuable for lightweight but strong frames. Pine and cedar for masts and hull planks. Lusitanian resin, a sticky waterproof substance used to seal ships. Though not exploited on a massive scale until later, these natural resources became part of Rome's longer-term plan. Naval engineers began to envision shipyards in the West not for war fleets, but for support craft, patrol boats, and coastal transport vessels. Rome was not just moving toward the Atlantic. It was building to stay. Reflections from the Edge. By the early 1st century BCE, Lusitania was still not fully conquered. Rebellions continued inland. The tribes were resistant, mobile, and skilled in ambush warfare. But Rome was learning. Not just about combat, but about weather, wind, water, the edge of the known world. Ships had become quieter, convoys more regular, river ports more refined. The frontier had not been tamed, but it had been measured. And in Roman history, Measurement was the first step toward mastery. By 138 BCE, the Roman Republic faced a question it had long postponed. Could Lusitania ever be fully brought under control? Years of intermittent diplomacy and punitive raids had accomplished little. Tribal alliances shifted unpredictably. Fortresses appeared on hills the Romans hadn't mapped. Supply lines failed in the rugged terrain. And the coast wild, tidal, and unpredictable made Rome's usual methods of warfare harder to apply. Then came Decimus Junius Brutus Calicus, a consul and general with a different approach. Unlike his predecessors, Brutus understood that the conquest of Lusitania would not be won by land alone. It would depend on boats, rivers, and tides. And so he brought the sea with him. The strategy, a river-based invasion. Brutus's campaign in 137–136 BCE was designed not just to conquer, but to circumvent the logistical barriers that had stalled previous invasions. His plan was simple, if unconventional. Use the Atlantic coast to transport men and supplies. Penetrate inland via navigable rivers, avoiding treacherous overland routes. Establish temporary river ports to resupply marching legions deeper in tribal territory. The heart of this strategy lay in two rivers. The Tagus River, wide, slow-moving, and leading far inland toward key Lusitanian settlements. The Douro River, more rugged, but a vital corridor into the northern highlands. To Roman ears, these rivers were lifelines. To Lusitanian ears, they were intrusions. Building the river fleet. Rome's standard military navy, the sleek triremes and quinquiremes of the Punic Wars, was ill-suited to inland water. So Brutus commissioned a specialized fleet of flat-bottomed boats and shallow-draft transports. Liburnians, small and agile, ideal for scouting ahead. Navis Lussoria, oar-driven patrol boats adapted from earlier Danubian models. Cargo barges rigged with sails and reinforced hulls for rough tidal conditions. These vessels were built, in part, from local timber, drawing on the abundant pine forests of western Iberia. Crews included sailors trained in both ocean and river conditions, engineers tasked with setting up temporary piers and floating docks, armed marines who could deploy quickly if attacked during landings. This wasn't just an army marching with a fleet. It was an amphibious campaign. Operations along the Tagus. The first major test of Brutus's approach came as his forces moved up the Tagus River, using Alasipo, modern Lisbon, as a coastal base. Here, the river widened like a bay, allowing even large transports to navigate inland for dozens of miles. As the fleet moved upriver, land-based patrols marched alongside, keeping watch from bluffs and hills. Local guides, some coerced, others bribed, were used to navigate complex tributaries. Supply barges followed in staggered intervals, ensuring constant flow of grain, water, and equipment. Lusitanian resistance was fierce but disjointed. The speed of the river approach caught many off guard. Hilltop settlements that once seemed unreachable found Roman soldiers at their gates, not from the land, but from the water. Ambushes and adaptation. The Lusitani, however, were not passive victims. At several river bends, they set traps. Narrow passages where boulders could be rolled onto passing vessels. Hidden shoals where logs and sharpened stakes had been submerged. Night raids on Roman floating depots using small canoes and local fishing boats. Brutus, to his credit, adapted. Ships traveled in tighter formation, with rear guards and forward scouts. At night, riverbank camps were built on elevated ground and surrounded by ditches. Fire signals were developed to communicate between land and water units. It was a slow campaign, filled with logistical setbacks, sudden attacks, and the steady erosion of morale. But it moved forward, which, in Lusitania, was a victory unto itself. North to the Durius. By the second year of the campaign, Brutus turned north. The Durius River, narrower and more difficult, offered a direct path into the Gallici territories, fiercely independent tribes occupying what is now northern Portugal and Galicia. Here, Roman rivercraft encountered harsher conditions. Swifter currents, making upstream navigation a constant struggle. Colder rains, which soaked supplies and weakened morale. Steeper valleys, where ambushes were even harder to detect. Yet the fleet endured. The Romans established temporary ports at natural bends and small estuaries, nomming each with Latin markers, some of which survive in fragmentary inscriptions today. In one notable episode, Brutus ordered a bridge of boats constructed across a particularly turbulent stretch of River A feet that required 9 days and 3 failed attempts. The crossing allowed him to flank a key Gallici encampment, forcing a surrender. Here, the sea and river had worked as partners, delivering Rome to a place it had never been. Discipline in the middle of nowhere. Throughout these campaigns, one thread held everything together: maritime logistics. Ships brought wine, vinegar, and medical supplies from Gads and Carthago Nova. Every 3 weeks, fresh legions were rotated through Alicipo, giving soldiers rest and respite. Damaged vessels were repaired in makeshift shipyards manned by enslaved local craftsmen. This was not the grand scale of Punic naval warfare, but it was naval warfare all the same, just in miniature, on muddy banks and within the forests of the unknown. The enemy did not wear armor. The terrain did not welcome wheels. The coast offered no shelter from storms. And yet the Roman line, slow, boring, disciplined, held. End of the campaigns. In 136 BCE, Brutus withdrew from the region. He had not conquered all of Lusitania. No Roman general ever truly would. But he had pushed the frontier further than any Roman before him. Charted rivers and coasts, once blank on Roman maps. Demonstrated that maritime strategy could work even in an unfriendly sea. He earned the agnomen Calicus, conqueror of the Gallici, for his efforts. But perhaps more lasting was the routine he left behind. A coastal base at Alicipo. A system of river portage and floating supply stations. A military tradition of thinking with boats, even on land. Rome would return to Lusitania again and again, not because of glory, but because of need. And each time, it would do so with the memory of rivers that once resisted. Victory in Lusitania, if you can call it that, did not arrive with a parade. It arrived in pieces. An improved dock in Alicipo. A new tax collector stationed at Bracara. A signal tower built on the cliff above the Douro estuary. These were not acts of conquest. They were acts of permanence. And slowly, over the next few decades, Rome shifted its relationship to the Atlantic from exploration and war to something far more Roman. Maintenance. The wild edge of the known world was becoming part of the known routine. Port Alicipo, from anchorage to hub. What had begun as a provisional military anchorage, a safe spot in a treacherous tidal region, began its transformation into a functional Roman port. By the early 1st century BCE, stone quays were constructed along the banks of the Tagus. Storage warehouses Horia lined the waterfront, some for grain, others for salt fish, oil, and wool. A watchtower with fire beacon was erected to guide ships through fog and warn of Atlantic storms. Veterans of Brutus's campaign were granted land nearby, forming the foundation of a Romanized settlement. Alicipo, modern-day Lisbon, had no ancient legacy like Carthage or Alexandria. But it had utility. And in the logic of Roman administration, that was more than enough. The Atlantic trade winds and the new economy. Rome never made the Atlantic its central highway, the Mediterranean remained the imperial sea. But over time, small Atlantic routes became commercial capillaries, feeding Rome's bloodstream with goods the East could not provide. From the Lusitanian coast came salted fish, especially garum, the fermented fish sauce beloved in Roman kitchens; tin and gold, extracted from inland mines and ferried to the coast by river; cork, harvested from forests near Alessippo and shipped in bundles; amphorae filled with resin, used in shipbuilding and waterproofing. These were not glamorous exports. They were useful. Ships no longer traveled west for conquest. They traveled for contracts. Maritime administration in the provinces. As Lusitania was formally annexed into the Roman Empire under Augustus, late 1st century BCE, its maritime administration was absorbed into Rome's broader provincial bureaucracy. That meant a curator navalis stationed in Alessippo to oversee port maintenance and shipping inspections; annual tax quotas tied to exported fish, metals, and timber; a permanent detachment of the classis Lusitanica, the local naval patrol fleet. The coast was still dangerous. Winter storms could delay shipping for weeks, but Roman planners built around it. Seasonal schedules were published for safe shipping months. Granaries were overstocked in anticipation of bad weather. Scribes kept weather records, correlating tidal behavior with harvest and export patterns. Rome could not control the Atlantic, but it could account for it. Cultural drift and coastal Romanization. With the ships came people: soldiers, traders, freedmen, clerks. By the turn of the era, the western coast began to exhibit signs of Roman cultural drift. Latin inscriptions on grave markers and dedications, often mixed with native Lusitanian names. Roman baths constructed in newly settled coastal towns. Temples to Neptune and Mercury, gods of the sea and commerce, appearing near port plazas. The gradual adoption of Roman timekeeping and calendars, even in remote fishing villages. But this was not full assimilation. Local languages endured, tribal customs remained. What emerged instead was a coastal hybridity Roman administration layered over a Lusitanian foundation. Fishermen still tied boats the old way. Marketplaces still bartered in local dialects. But taxes were filed in Latin, and the harbormaster wore a Roman toga. Rome's Atlantic routine. By the mid-1st century CE, the routine was set. Each spring, a wave of merchant ships arrived from Baetica and Narbonensis, carrying wine, oil, and ceramics. Fishing season began in earnest, with fleets sailing out into the cold Atlantic for weeks at a time. Tax shipments were loaded and sent back east in amphorae, crates, and iron-bound chests. Naval patrols continued, less for pirates than for rescue and regulation. Lighthouses dotted the cliffs, each with a unique flame pattern for nighttime navigation. Roman Lusitania no longer required conquest. It required calendars, ships, and records. And above all, reliability. Decline but not disappearance. As the centuries passed and Rome's frontiers began to falter, the Atlantic coast retained a quiet durability. Even into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Roman shipping logs mention Lusitanian ports as grain and fish suppliers. Coins minted in Alessippo continued circulation as far east as Gaul. The region became a retreat for Roman elites, drawn by mild weather and relatively stable governance. When the Western Empire finally began to crack, Lusitania was among the last regions to fall into disorder. Its transformation had never been dramatic, its conquest never decisive, but in its steadiness, it had become Roman to the bone. Reflection, the empire's edge anchored by routine. There are no epic poems about Roman ships on the Tagus. No triumphant frescoes of Brutus's barges. no tailies of Atlantic legions immortalized in marble. But perhaps that's the point, because empires at their core are not built only by glory. They are built by timetables, salted fish, dock workers, tax ledgers, signal towers lighting foggy bays. The Lusitanian coast never became Rome's heartland, but it became part of its heartbeat. A place where, far from the Senate and the circus, men in sandals tied boats to posts and waited for tides. And in that waiting, that quiet, steady motion, an empire held.